Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the quiet places on the map sometimes turn out to be the ones with the most to say. There is a kind of landscape that looks completely ordinary until you spend enough time in it. Rolling fields, a river catching the light in the late afternoon, mountains sitting blue and distant on the horizon, the smell of dry earth and something green underneath it. Nothing about it announces itself as unusual. Nothing about it says, pay attention. And yet for some places that ordinariness is almost a disguise. A surface of the familiar laid over something that has never quite been explained. Tonight we're going to spend some time in one of those places, a wide agricultural valley in the state of Washington, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, where people grow apples and hops and pears, where the river runs cold out of the mountains, where the summer nights are long and the skies enormous, a place called Yakima Valley. Before we get into what has been seen here, and what has been documented, and what has puzzled researchers and pilots and government agencies for more than 50 years, it is worth just sitting with the valley itself for a moment, because the place matters. The geography matters. And if you're going to understand why this particular corner of Washington state has become one of the most consistently documented UFO hotspots in American history, you need to understand what it looks like and what it feels like to actually be there. Yakima Valley sits in south-central Washington, roughly in the center of the state if you're measuring east to west. To the west, the Cascade Range rises up in a long dark wall, volcanic peaks and dense forest, and the mountains block most of the moisture coming off the Pacific Ocean. That is why the valley is dry. Surprisingly dry, actually, for the Pacific Northwest, which most people picture as rainy and green. The rain shadow of the Cascades turns the eastern side of the range into something closer to semi-arid high desert. Sagebrush grows here. The soil is pale and dusty when it has not been irrigated. Summer temperatures regularly climb above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes well above it. To the east, the land opens out onto the Columbia Plateau, a vast elevated plain of ancient basalt laid down by some of the largest volcanic eruptions in the geological history of North America. The plateau stretches east for hundreds of miles, flat and wide, and the sky above it is the kind of sky that people from cloudier parts of the country sometimes find almost overwhelming. There is just so much of it. On a clear night, which is most nights in summer, the stars come out in a way that reminds you that the Milky Way is a real thing you can actually see, not just a photograph. The Yakima River cuts through the valley from north to south, fed by snowmelt from the Cascades, and it is the reason the valley is as productive as it is. Without irrigation, this would be scrubland. With it, the valley floor is covered in hop yards and apple orchards and vineyards, row after row of carefully tended agriculture that makes Yakima one of the most important agricultural regions in the entire country. Roughly 75% of all the hops grown in the United States come from this valley. The apple industry here is enormous. Drive through in late summer and the smell of the orchards is something you do not forget easily, sweet and warm and slightly dusty all at once. The city of Yakima itself sits near the northern end of the valley, a working city of around 96,000 people, with a broader metropolitan area and surrounding region, pushing the total population to somewhere around 250,000. It is not a small town. It has hospitals and universities and a minor league baseball team, and all the ordinary infrastructure of a mid-sized American city. This is not a remote outpost. People have lived and worked here continuously for a very long time, and that includes the Yakama Nation, whose reservation lands cover a substantial portion of the southern part of the valley and the higher terrain to the south and east. The Yakama people have inhabited this region for thousands of years, and their relationship with the land here, with the ridges and the rivers and the plateau, runs far deeper than any of the agricultural development that came later. The reservation itself covers about 1.2 million acres, and it includes some of the most significant terrain in this whole story. Terrain that we will spend a good deal of time with tonight. Running along the southern edge of the valley, separating the flat agricultural floor from the higher plateau country to the south, there is a series of ridges, long, low, east-west running ridges, geologically distinct from the surrounding terrain, formed by tectonic compression over millions of years. The most significant of these, for our purposes tonight, is called Toppenish Ridge. It sits almost entirely within the Yakima Reservation. It rises to around 3,000 feet, and for reasons that nobody has fully explained, it has been at the centre of something very unusual for more than half a century. But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Before we get to the ridge, it is worth pausing for a moment and just asking you a simple question. Where are you right now as you listen to this? What does your sky look like tonight? Are you somewhere with a wide open view where you could actually see the horizon if you stepped outside? Or are you in a city where the light pollution turns the sky a kind of amber orange and the stars disappear? Maybe it is late where you are and the house is quiet and you're just listening in the dark. Or maybe it is afternoon and you're driving somewhere, the road stretching out ahead of you. Whatever your sky looks like tonight, keep it in mind. Because a lot of what makes Yakima Valley interesting is simply the fact that it has the kind of sky where you notice things. Wide, dark, and very, very clear. If you are enjoying this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling, and you find yourself wanting more of it, the best thing you can do is hit the like button and subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It genuinely helps the channel, and it means you'll be here the next time we sit down with a place like this one. It takes about 2 seconds and it makes a real difference. Thank you sincerely. Now, back to the valley. What makes Yakima Valley interesting as a landscape, before you introduce any element of the unusual, is the combination of things it contains. You have a highly productive, densely worked agricultural region. You have a major indigenous nation with deep historical roots in the land. You have the geological drama of the Cascade Range on one side, and the vast basalt plateau on the other. You have long summer nights and exceptionally clear skies. You have a river system that has shaped the entire human and ecological history of the area. And you have, sitting quietly to the south, a series of ridges that have been watched by fire lookouts and tribal members and researchers, and eventually government agencies for generations. People in this valley have always watched the sky. It is partly practical. When you are farming, you watch the weather. When you're working a fire lookout station on a ridge, watching the sky is literally your job. The Yakima people, like most indigenous nations of the inland Pacific Northwest, have a relationship with the natural world that involves close, sustained attention to the landscape in all its moods and movements. And the non-tribal agricultural communities of the valley have their own long tradition of being outdoors, working outdoors, noticing the world around them. The point is that this is not a place where a single person, in isolation, looked up one night and saw something strange and told a story that got repeated and exaggerated. This is a place where many different kinds of people, with many different reasons to be paying attention to the sky and the ridgelines, have been reporting similar things for a very long time. That consistency is part of what makes the Yakima Valley story unusual among UFO hotspots. It is not built on one dramatic incident. It is built on 50 years of quiet, careful, sometimes methodical observation. The agricultural rhythm of the valley gives the story a kind of grounding that is easy to overlook. These are not people who are out searching for something extraordinary. The fire lookouts were watching for smoke. The farmers were watching for frost warnings. The tribal rangers were watching for anything that might affect the land under their care. The unusual things they began reporting in the early 1970s were not things they were looking for. They were things that simply appeared and kept appearing, and eventually could not be ignored. There is something about the physical character of the valley that stays with you once you know the story. The way the ridgelines sit against the sky in the late evening, when the light has gone gold and then pink and then finally deep blue, the way the irrigated fields smell in July, warm and green in the middle of all that dry sage country, the way the stars come out over the plateau one by one and then all at once, until the sky is genuinely crowded with them. It is a beautiful place, a working, practical, inhabited, beautiful place, and it is exactly the kind of place where, if something genuinely unusual has been happening for 50 years, you might expect the people who live there to know about it They do, or at least many of them do, and some of them have kept very careful records. The story of how Yakima Valley came to the attention of serious researchers and eventually to the attention of the US Air Force's own scientific consultants does not begin with a dramatic sighting or a headline. It begins with something much quieter. A fire control officer on the Yakima reservation, working his ridge, keeping his logs, and noticing that what he was seeing in the sky over Toppenish Ridge did not match anything in his training or his experience. And it begins with the fact that he did not just tell people about it. He wrote it down, carefully, methodically, night after night, with times and durations and directions and descriptions. The kind of documentation that eventually would make it very hard for anyone to simply wave the whole thing away. That is where the real story starts. Not with a flash of light or a dramatic encounter, but with a man doing his job on a ridge in central Washington, watching the sky the way he had been trained to watch it, and slowly coming to understand that something out there was not behaving the way it should. His name was Bill Vogel, and his job was fire. Not setting it, watching for it. As a fire control officer with the Bureau of Indian Affairs on the Yakima Indian Reservation, Vogel's work was essentially about attention. You learned the landscape until you knew its normal rhythms, its colours, its shadows. You learned what smoke looked like at different times of day, how it moved in different winds, how to distinguish a distant column from a low cloud or a dust plume rising off a dry road. You spent a lot of time on ridges, looking out over a very large piece of country, and you learned to trust your own eyes. Bill Vogel trusted his eyes, which is part of why, when he began seeing things over Toppenish Ridge in the early 1970s that he could not account for, he did not simply dismiss them. He started writing them down. Toppenish Ridge runs roughly east to west for about 20 miles, sitting like a long spine along the southern edge of the Yakima Valley floor. From the valley it rises to around 3,000 feet, and from its crest you can see an enormous amount of country, the valley stretching north toward the city of Yakima, the Columbia Plateau spreading out to the south and east, and on clear days the volcanic peaks of the Cascades lined up to the west like a row of white teeth. It is a natural observation platform. The Bureau of Indian Affairs maintained fire lookout stations along the ridge, and Vogel and his colleagues worked them through the seasons, monitoring the dry sage and grass country that covered the reservation's lower slopes and the timber on the higher ground. It was practical, unglamorous work. And it was from these lookout stations in the early months of 1972 that Vogel began keeping a different kind of log. What he was seeing was not smoke. The objects he documented were lights, typically amber or orange in colour, glowing with a quality that observers consistently described as self-luminous rather than reflective. They were not the white or red and green of aircraft navigation lights. They did not blink in the regular pattern of a plane. They moved low over the ridgelines, sometimes skimming just above the terrain, sometimes hovering in place for extended periods before drifting or accelerating away. Vogel noted them with the same care he applied to everything else in his logs: time of observation, duration, direction of movement, estimated altitude, colour, and any behaviour that struck him as notable. He was not a dramatic man by the accounts of those who worked with him. He was methodical. He wrote things down because that was how you kept track of things. The lights were not a single, rare event. They appeared with a regularity that made them impossible to ignore. Over the course of 1972, Vogel accumulated a substantial body of observations, and he began to notice patterns. The lights seemed to favour certain areas of the ridge. They appeared more often in the late evening and early morning hours. They moved in ways that did not correspond to any aircraft he was familiar with, not just in their appearance, but in their behaviour. An aircraft, even a slow one, follows a more or less predictable path. These lights would stop. They would reverse direction without any kind of banking turn. They would drop suddenly toward the ridge and then rise again. And occasionally, they would do something that Vogel found particularly striking. They would respond. This is one of the more unusual elements of the early Yakima documentation, and it is worth spending a moment on because it recurs across multiple independent observers over many years. Vogel and later other lookout workers found that shining a flashlight toward one of the objects sometimes produced a reaction. The object might move in the direction of the light. It might change its own luminosity, dimming or brightening, in a way that seemed correlated with the flashlight signal. It might approach. This did not happen every time, and Vogel was careful not to overstate it. But it happened often enough that he noted it specifically in his logs, and he was not the only one. Other fire lookout observers on the reservation reported the same experience independently. That consistency across different observers is what makes the detail worth noting. It's not a story that one person told once. It is something that several people, working different stations at different times, described in similar terms. By the time Vogel had been keeping his logs for the better part of a year, the accumulated record was substantial enough that it came to the attention of researchers outside the reservation. Exactly how the connection was made is not entirely clear from the historical record, but by 1972 and into 1973, the Yakima observations had reached someone who was very well positioned to take them seriously. His name was J. Allen Hynek, and he was arguably the most credentialed scientific figure who had ever given sustained attention to the UFO question in the United States. Hynek had been the US Air Force's scientific consultant for Project Blue Book, the government's official UFO investigation program, from 1948 until the program's closure in 1969. He'd come into that role as a skeptic, a working astronomer at Ohio State University, who expected to spend a few months helping the Air Force explain away misidentifications and move on. He ended up spending 20 years in the role, and somewhere along the way his position shifted. What changed Hynek was not any single dramatic case. It was the accumulation of cases that resisted easy explanation, the ones that came from credible observers, that were internally consistent, that involved behaviours or characteristics that did not fit any conventional category. By the time Project Blue Book closed, Hynek had concluded that a small but genuine percentage of UFO reports described something that current science could not account for, and that dismissing all of them as misidentification or delusion was not intellectually honest. In 1973, the same year that Vogel's logs were drawing outside attention, Hynek founded the Center for UFO Studies, CUFOS, in Evanston, Illinois. It was an attempt to bring serious, methodical scientific investigation to a subject that had been poorly served by both government secrecy and uncritical enthusiasm. Hynek became aware of the Yakima material and recognized in Vogel's logs exactly the kind of careful, sustained documentation that he had rarely encountered in his years of reviewing UFO reports. Most sightings were single events, reported after the fact by a single observer with no supporting data. Vogel's logs were something different, a systematic record built over months by a trained observer whose job required him to watch the same terrain night after night, with consistent detail and no apparent motivation to exaggerate. Hynek sent one of his researchers to investigate. His name was David Akers, and in 1972 and 1973, Akers conducted what became one of the more rigorous pieces of fieldwork associated with any UFO hotspot in American history. Akers set up observation posts on Toppenish Ridge. He brought equipment, binoculars, cameras, instruments capable of measuring light intensity. He spent nights on the ridge, waiting, watching, and when objects appeared, documenting them as precisely as his equipment allowed. And objects did appear. Akers was not simply taking Vogel's word for it. He saw the lights himself. He described orange and amber glowing spheres, moving silently at low altitudes over the ridge. He documented objects that moved against the prevailing wind direction, ruling out certain atmospheric explanations. He noted the absence of sound. In the quiet of a ridge at night, even a distant conventional aircraft is audible long before it is visible, and these objects produced nothing. He photographed what he could, though the light's behaviour made clean imagery difficult to capture. What Akers produced at the end of his fieldwork was a formal report, not a sensational account, not a press release, but a documented analysis of what had been observed, under what conditions, with what equipment, and what conventional explanations had been considered and found insufficient. The report noted the consistency of what was being seen across multiple independent observers. It noted the specific behaviours, the hovering, the directional changes, the apparent flashlight responses that did not fit standard explanations, and it was honest about what remained unknown. Akers did not claim to know what the lights were. He claimed that they were real, that they were unusual, and that they merited further investigation. That was enough for Hynek. Hynek himself visited the Yakima area, and his assessment of the sightings was, by his own measured standards, fairly strong. He described the Yakima reports as among the most credible and internally consistent he had encountered in his career. Coming from a man who had spent 2 decades reviewing thousands of UFO reports for the US Air Force, that was not a casual remark. Hynek was not prone to enthusiasm. He had built his reputation on careful skepticism, and he had frustrated both true believers and hardline debunkers in equal measure over the years because he refused to let either camp claim him. When he said the Yakima material was credible, he meant it in the strict sense. It was worthy of serious consideration, not easily dismissed, and not easily explained. What is worth pausing on here in the early 1970s is just how unusual this situation was. You had a Bureau of Indian Affairs fire control officer keeping methodical nightly logs of unexplained aerial phenomena. You had a formally trained scientific investigator spending weeks on a ridge with instruments, personally observing the same phenomena and producing a written report. And you had the US Air Force's own former scientific consultant reviewing that report and finding it credible. This was not the tabloid version of UFO investigation. This was, by any reasonable standard, the kind of careful, documented, multi-observer process that you would want to apply to any unexplained phenomenon. And what it produced was not an answer, it produced a well-documented question. The specific geography of Toppenish Ridge kept coming up in everything Akers and Vogel documented, and that specificity is itself interesting. The lights were not scattered randomly across the valley, they were concentrated. They appeared over this particular ridge, in this particular stretch of the reservation, with a consistency that suggested something about the location itself might be relevant. Whether that something was geological or related to the reservation's land use patterns or something else entirely, nobody could say at the time. But the pattern was clear enough that the ridge itself became the focal point of any serious investigation into what was happening over the Yakima Valley. Later researchers would return to it again and again, trying to understand not just what was being seen, but why here specifically, why this ridge, this stretch of basalt and sage, this particular crease in the landscape of central Washington. Vogel's logs from this period survive in various forms in the UFO research literature, and reading through the descriptions, even at a remove of 50 years, gives you a sense of how genuinely strange the observations were. The amber lights moving just above the ridge line, the object that hovered for 20 minutes then dropped behind the ridge and was gone, the light that appeared to split into 2 distinct objects, both of which continued moving independently before one faded and the other drifted south. These are not the descriptions of a man who was frightened or confused. They read like field notes, precise, unemotional, and quietly baffling. What Vogel and Akers had established by the mid-1970s was a foundation, not an explanation, but a documented record of something that was happening in a specific place, with enough consistency and enough credible witnesses to make the easy dismissals ring hollow. The Valley had been producing these reports for years before anyone outside it paid attention, and it would continue to produce them long after the first wave of investigation had wound down. But the early 1970s work, Vogel's logs, Akers' fieldwork, Hynek's assessment, gave the Yakima Valley story something that most UFO hotspots never get: a serious, careful, documented starting point. A record that did not depend on memory or rumour, but on notes taken at the time by people who had no particular reason to invent what they were describing. and that record raised a question that the investigation had barely begun to address. What exactly was being seen over Toppenish Ridge? Akers had ruled out a number of conventional explanations through direct observation, but ruling things out is not the same as finding an answer. The lights continue to appear, the logs continue to grow, and the question of what was producing them, night after night over this particular ridge in this particular valley, remained as open as the sky above it. The next step in understanding what was happening would require looking not just at what people were seeing, but at the specific character of those observations in much finer detail. Because the more carefully you examine what the lights actually did, how they moved, how they behaved, what they seemed to respond to, the harder it becomes to fit them into any single tidy explanation. So let us slow down and look more carefully at what was actually being documented. Because the specifics matter here. They matter a great deal. The most commonly reported form, across dozens of separate observations logged by Vogel, and confirmed through Akers fieldwork, was a glowing sphere. Amber or orange in colour, sometimes described as a deep reddish orange, roughly consistent in apparent size, though estimating actual size at night over a dark ridge is genuinely difficult. At the distances involved, which were sometimes a few hundred metres and sometimes considerably more, witnesses compared the apparent size to a basketball or, in closer cases, something closer to a small car. Not enormous, not tiny. Just this quiet, self-illuminated sphere, moving at low altitude over the ridgeline, without any sound that observers could detect. This silence is worth dwelling on for a moment. It was one of the most consistent features across all the reports. Modern aircraft of any kind make noise. Helicopters are unmistakable. Even high-altitude jets leave a sound trail. But the objects observed over Toppenish Ridge were, in the vast majority of cases, completely silent. Vogel noted this repeatedly in his logs. Akers confirmed it from his own observation posts. Multiple independent witnesses asked separately to describe what they had seen, mentioned the absence of sound before they were even prompted. It was not something they had to think about. It was simply one of the first things they noticed, because it was wrong. You see a light moving through the night sky and your brain expects a sound to follow. When none comes, the wrongness of it registers immediately. The movement patterns were the other thing that consistently set these observations apart from anything easily explained. Conventional aircraft move in arcs and straight lines, following the physics of lift and thrust. Even unconventional aircraft, experimental designs, unusual configurations, still obey basic aerodynamic constraints. What was being logged over Toppenish Ridge did not always behave that way. Objects would hover in place for extended periods, sometimes 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes longer, with no visible means of maintaining altitude. Then they would accelerate, not gradually, the way a plane builds speed on a runway, but quickly, almost abruptly, and move off in a new direction. Sometimes that new direction was straight up, sometimes it was lateral, cutting across the ridge at low altitude before disappearing behind a slope. Akers documented a specific pattern that he found particularly difficult to categorize. On multiple occasions, he observed lights that would descend toward the ridge, slow, and then appear to go into the hillside itself. Not behind it, not below the visible horizon, into it, as if passing through the rock. He was careful in how he described this. He did not claim to know what it meant. He noted the observation, noted the conditions, noted that the light did not reappear on the other side of the ridge, as it would have if it had simply flown over, and left the interpretation open. But he wrote it down. And similar descriptions appear in Vogel's logs, from observations made before Akers arrived, which means the two men were independently recording the same type of event without having coordinated their descriptions. The reverse also happened. Objects appeared to emerge from hillsides or from ground level, rising from the ridge itself rather than descending from above. A light would simply be there, at ridge level, where no light had been a moment before. Then it would rise, move, and behave in the ways already described. Whether these were the same objects entering and later exiting, or different events entirely, was impossible to determine. But the ground-level emergence pattern was consistent enough to be notable. Then there is the flashlight behaviour, which is perhaps the strangest documented feature of the entire Yakima phenomenon, and the one that has generated the most discussion over the decades. On multiple occasions, observers on Toppenish Ridge, including both Vogel and Akers on separate nights, tried shining a flashlight toward one of the observed objects. This was not a casual experiment. It was a deliberate attempt to see whether the object would respond to a directed light signal, the way you might try to get the attention of a distant boat at sea. What happened, in several documented cases, was that the object did respond, not always in the same way. Sometimes it moved toward the observer, sometimes it appeared to brighten, as if increasing its own output in reply. In a small number of cases, the object appeared to mimic the flash pattern. If the observer flashed the light twice, the object pulsed twice in return. Akers was particularly careful in how he documented these exchanges, because he understood how extraordinary the claim was. He noted the exact flash sequences used, the timing, the apparent response, and the conditions under which the observation was made. He was not claiming that the objects were communicating in any meaningful sense. He was claiming that there appeared to be a behavioural response to directed light, and that this response was inconsistent with any natural phenomenon he could identify. Ball lightning does not respond to flashlights. Temperature inversions do not pulse in reply to human signals. Whatever was producing the lights over Toppenish Ridge was, at minimum, behaving in a way that appeared reactive. This detail, the apparent responsiveness, is what most sharply separates the Yakima observations from the category of simple misidentification. If you see an unusual light in the sky, and you're not sure what it is, the most reasonable first step is to consider whether it might be a known aircraft, a weather balloon, a planet near the horizon, a reflection, or any number of other mundane sources. Those explanations are always worth exhausting before moving on to more unusual ones. But a temperature inversion does not move toward you when you shine a light at it. A misidentified aircraft does not alter its behaviour in apparent response to a ground-level signal. The reactivity, if accurately documented, points towards something that is either capable of detecting and responding to external stimuli, or coincidentally mimicking that behaviour in a way that is itself very difficult to explain. Hynek was aware of all of this when he made his assessment. He had spent 20 years reviewing UFO reports for the Air Force, and he had developed a fairly precise internal sense of which cases were likely misidentifications, which were honest but confused observations, and which represented something genuinely puzzling. The Yakima material, in his view, fell firmly into the last category. Not because it was dramatic or sensational, it was actually quite the opposite of that, but because it was so carefully documented, so consistent across multiple independent observers, and so resistant to the standard explanatory frameworks he had applied to thousands of other cases. Hynek had a concept he used to describe cases where the reported observations could not be adequately explained by any known natural or human-made phenomenon. He called them true unknowns, and he was sparing with the label. He applied it to a small percentage of the cases he reviewed, maybe 5% across his entire career with Blue Book, and he always insisted that the category meant exactly what it said. Not that the objects were extraterrestrial, not that they were supernatural, but that they were genuinely unknown, and that genuine unknowns deserved serious scientific attention rather than reflexive dismissal. By his own standards, the Yakima material qualified. What is interesting about Hynek's position is how carefully he held it. He was not a believer in the popular sense. He did not go around telling people that aliens were visiting Toppenish Ridge. He was a scientist who had spent decades being frustrated by the Air Force's unwillingness to take the subject seriously, and who had eventually concluded that the dismissiveness was itself a kind of scientific failure, a refusal to engage with data that did not fit comfortable categories. His founding of the Center for UFO Studies in 1973 was, in part, a direct response to that frustration. He wanted a place where the data could be examined without the institutional pressure to explain everything away. The Yakima investigation was one of the first major field efforts CUFOS undertook, and Akers' report became one of the foundational documents in the organization's early archive. It was not a flashy document. It did not make extravagant claims. It was a careful, methodical account of what a trained observer had seen and measured over several weeks in the field, with a clear statement of what conventional explanations had been considered and found insufficient. That kind of careful, restrained documentation is actually fairly rare in the UFO research literature, where the temptation to interpret and dramatize often overwhelms the discipline to simply record. Akers resisted that temptation, and the result is a document that holds up reasonably well even decades later, because it is grounded in observation rather than interpretation. The Yakima Training Center, a large US Army installation that occupies a significant portion of land north and east of the valley, was one of the conventional explanations that both Vogel and Akers considered and largely set aside, though not entirely. The training center conducts live-fire exercises, artillery training and various military operations, and it is not inconceivable that some of what was seen over the years represented military flares, illumination rounds, or experimental equipment being tested in a relatively isolated area. Vogel was familiar enough with the training center's activity patterns to distinguish its typical output from what he was logging. Military flares behave in specific ways. They drift with the wind, they burn for a predictable duration, they do not hover, accelerate, or respond to flashlights. The objects he was documenting did not match that profile. That said, the proximity of a large military installation to a UFO hotspot is never entirely irrelevant. The Yakima Training Center covers roughly 329,000 acres, making it one of the larger military training areas in the western United States. It has been used for testing various systems over the decades, and not all of what happens there is publicly documented. It is reasonable to hold open the possibility that some fraction of the Yakima sightings, particularly in certain years, might reflect classified military activity. The problem is that this explanation, even if partially valid, does not account for the flashlight responses, the ground-level emergence events, or the fact that the same types of observations had been made on the reservation for generations before the modern military presence in the area took its current form. By the mid-1970s, what Hynek and CUFOS had established through the Yakima investigation was something genuinely useful. A documented, geographically specific, multi-observer record of unusual aerial phenomena concentrated over a particular ridge in central Washington. The investigation had produced more questions than answers, but the questions were good ones. They were specific, testable in principle, and grounded in careful observation rather than rumour. The lights over Toppenish Ridge were real in the sense that multiple credible, careful people had seen them, logged them, and attempted to explain them without success. What they were remained unknown, and the landscape itself, the ridge, the basalt, the dry sage-covered slopes, the wide dark sky above the valley, offered no easy answers. It simply continued to be what it had always been, a place where, for reasons that nobody had yet managed to fully explain, unusual things appeared in the night sky with a consistency that was hard to ignore and harder to dismiss. The physical character of that landscape, it turns out, may be part of the story in ways that nobody in the early 1970s had quite begun to examine. Because beneath the orchards and the reservation land, beneath the ridge itself, there is a geology that is unusual in its own right, a tectonic history written in compressed basalt and folded rock that some researchers would later argue might have a direct bearing on what people were seeing in the sky above it. So let us slow down for a moment and actually look at what was being seen, not the broader context, not the investigators, not the institutional history, just the phenomena itself. What did the lights actually look like? How did they move? What made them strange enough that trained, careful observers kept coming back to document them across years of fieldwork? The most commonly reported form, across dozens of logged observations from the early 1970s through the mid-decade wave, was a glowing sphere. Amber, mostly. Sometimes a deeper orange, occasionally described as reddish gold. The colour was consistent enough that multiple independent observers used almost the same language without having coordinated their descriptions. Vogel's logs use the word amber repeatedly. Acre's report describes the dominant colour as orange amber. Tribal fire lookout observers on the ridge used different words, but the colour they pointed to was the same part of the spectrum. The apparent size varied with distance, as you would expect, but observers who felt they had a reasonably good sense of how far away the objects were tended to estimate them as somewhere between the apparent size of a basketball and something closer to a compact car. Not enormous, not tiny. Something in that middle range that made them clearly visible but not overwhelming. A presence in the sky rather than a spectacle. They were silent. That detail comes up again and again, and it is worth pausing on because it matters more than it might initially seem. The Toppenish Ridge area at night is not a noisy environment. The valley below has its sounds, irrigation equipment, occasional traffic, the ambient hum of agricultural activity, but up on the ridge itself, at the elevation where the lookout station sat, the nights are genuinely quiet. Sound carries well in that kind of terrain. A conventional aircraft, even at a moderate distance, produces sound that precedes and follows it. Helicopters are loud. Military flares, when they deploy, involve a delivery mechanism that makes noise. The objects being logged over the ridge made none. Observers who described an object passing relatively close, within what they estimated as a few hundred yards, consistently noted that the silence was itself disorienting. You expect something that large and that bright to make a sound. When it does not, something in your brain flags the wrongness of it, before you have consciously processed what you are looking at. The movement patterns were varied but had recognisable types. Many sightings described a slow, hovering progression along the ridgeline, the object moving at roughly walking pace or slower at low altitude, sometimes dipping below the ridge crest and reappearing. Others described objects that were stationary for extended periods, sometimes 20 or 30 minutes, before accelerating away in a direction that seemed abrupt given the stillness that preceded it. The acceleration was not described as gradual. Witnesses said the object simply moved, from stopped to fast without the transitional physics you would expect from a conventional aircraft. No banking turn, no engine spool-up sound, no visible thrust. Just a change in position that happened faster than it should have. There were also the more unusual behaviours, the ones that pushed the observations beyond anything that atmospheric optics or aircraft could comfortably account for. Some objects appeared to descend into the hillside, not to land on it, not to disappear behind it from the observer's perspective, but to sink into the slope itself, the light dimming and vanishing in a way that several witnesses described as going underground rather than going away. This is a strange thing to try to picture, and it is worth saying plainly that there are mundane explanations for some versions of it. A light moving away from an observer while dropping in altitude can appear to merge with terrain. Atmospheric refraction can distort apparent position, but the observers who reported this were not casual bystanders. Vogel had years of experience watching the ridge at night. He knew what a light disappearing behind terrain looked like. The events he flagged as unusual were ones where the geometry did not support a simple line-of-sight explanation. The reverse also happened. Lights that appeared to emerge from hillsides or from ground level, brightening as if rising from below rather than arriving from a distance. A few cases describe what sounds like a light source that was not present and then was, at a location where no aircraft could have approached without being heard or seen in transit. Multiple lights splitting from one, or several merging into one. That behaviour was documented enough times to be considered part of the pattern rather than an outlier. Vogel logged at least a dozen instances over his years of observation where a single light became two, the two moving apart before one or both faded. The split was not described as an explosion, or a separation of mechanical parts. It was more like a cell dividing, or a flame producing a second flame, a smooth, quiet bifurcation that left two objects where one had been. Then there is the flashlight response. This is the detail that tends to stop people when they first encounter it, because it implies something that is genuinely difficult to fit into any conventional framework. The idea that a light source in the sky might react to a flashlight signal from an observer on the ground is not something that atmospheric phenomena do. Ball lightning does not respond to flashlights. Temperature inversions do not respond to flashlights. Military flares definitely do not respond to flashlights. The only things that respond to signals are things that can detect signals, which means some form of sensory apparatus, which implies a level of complexity that the tectonic light hypothesis, for example, cannot easily accommodate. Vogel documented the flashlight response multiple times. His method was simple. He would direct a handheld flashlight at an object and pulse it in a pattern, on, off, and observe whether anything changed in the object's behaviour. On several occasions, something did change. The object moved toward his position, or it mimicked the pattern, brightening and dimming in a sequence that matched what he had flashed. He was careful in how he logged these events. He noted the exact time, the duration of his signal, the interval, and what he observed afterward. He did not claim that the response was always clear, or that it happened every time he tried. He noted when it seemed to occur and when it did not. David Akers also documented a flashlight interaction during his fieldwork. In his formal report, he describes an occasion on Toppenish Ridge where he directed a light at an object and observed a subsequent change in the object's behaviour, a brightening followed by a directional shift toward his observation post. He was careful to note that he could not rule out coincidence. The object might have been moving in that direction anyway. The brightening might have been unrelated to his signal. He logged it as an unexplained correlation rather than a confirmed interaction, which is the right scientific posture. But he logged it because it happened, and pretending it did not would have been a different kind of failure. The absence of sound combined with the flashlight responses, taken together, a genuinely strange combination. Silence rules out most conventional explanations. The apparent responsiveness rules out most natural phenomena explanations. What you're left with is a category that does not have a clean name, something that behaves as though it is aware of its environment, moves without conventional propulsion, produces light without conventional combustion or electricity, and has been doing all of this over the same ridge for decades. Now, it is worth being honest here about the limits of what we actually know. These are reported observations. The flashlight response events, compelling as they are, rest on the testimony of individual observers and on notes taken in the field under difficult conditions, at night, under circumstances that are inherently hard to verify after the fact. The human brain is genuinely good at finding patterns in random data. We are wired for it. An observer who flashes a light at something and then watches it carefully is going to notice any subsequent movement or brightness change, and the mind tends to connect those events, even when the connection is not real. That is not a character flaw. It is just how perception works. The reason the Yakima cases are taken seriously by researchers who care about methodological rigour is not that any single observation is irrefutable. It is that the pattern holds across multiple independent observers over many years, with consistent descriptions of specific behaviours that were not publicly known to be associated with the Yakima area before the observers reported them. Vogel was not reading UFO magazines and then going out to look for what they described. He was a fire control officer doing his job who noticed something odd and started writing it down. Akers was not a believer looking for confirmation. He was a researcher who had been asked to evaluate a specific set of claims with specific equipment at a specific location. The consistency across their independent accounts, and across the accounts of tribal observers who had no connection to either of them, is the thing that makes the Yakima material harder to dismiss than most. What also makes it interesting, in a quieter way, is what the objects did not do. They did not land in front of crowds of people. They did not produce physical evidence that could be picked up and taken to a laboratory. They did not behave in ways that were clearly, unambiguously impossible. They behaved in ways that were merely very difficult to explain with the frameworks available. They were subtle in a way that feels almost deliberate, though that is the kind of observation that is easy to project onto something you cannot explain. The amber spheres over Toppenish Ridge did not announce themselves. They moved quietly along the ridge in the dark, visible to whoever happened to be watching, and then they were gone. The logs accumulated. The photographs were mostly inconclusive, a smear of light against a dark sky that could be anything. The instrumental readings Eckers gathered were suggestive but not definitive. The pattern was clear, the explanation was not. And the pattern, it turns out, had been noticed by more people than just the fire lookout observers and the CUFOS investigators. Because the ridge sits within the Yakima Nation reservation, and the Yakima people had been living alongside this landscape and its peculiarities for a great deal longer than any fire lookout station had existed. Their relationship with the land, and with what moved over it at night, was not something that began in 1972, and could not be understood separately from the deeper history of the place itself. The lights that Vogel was carefully logging in his notebooks were, from the perspective of some tribal members, not a new discovery at all. They were something the land had always done, and understanding what that means, what it says about the age and the character of whatever is happening in this valley, requires stepping back from the investigator's notebook and into a much longer story. The Yakima Nation has lived in this valley and on these ridges for thousands of years. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a geographical and historical fact that shapes everything about how the Yakima phenomena need to be understood. Long before there were fire lookout stations on Toppenish Ridge, long before there were orchards or irrigation canals or a city called Yakima, the people whose name the valley carries were here, watching the same sky, walking the same basalt ridge lines, and noticing the same things moving in the dark. The 1855 Treaty of Yakima, signed at Camp Stevens in what is now Walla Walla, established the Yakima Nation Reservation and set its boundaries, roughly 1.2 million acres, in what is now Yakima and Klickitat counties. The treaty was, like most treaties of that era, a negotiation conducted under enormous pressure, and what the Yakima people retained was a fraction of their original territory. But what they retained included Toppenish Ridge. It included the plateau lands to the south, the river corridors, and the high ground that would later become the consistent focal point of some of the most carefully documented anomalous observations in American history. The reservation is sovereign land. That matters practically legally, and in terms of understanding who has had the longest and most continuous relationship with whatever is happening there. The spiritual geography of the Yakima people is inseparable from the physical landscape. Specific ridges, river confluences, rock formations, and elevated places carry meaning that has been transmitted across generations, not as abstract belief, but as practical knowledge about how the land behaves and what it contains. Toppenish Ridge is not simply a topographic feature in Yakima cultural understanding. It is a place with a character, a history, and a significance that predates any written record by many centuries. Exactly what that significance is, and how it relates to the lights that have been observed there, is not something that can be fully translated into the vocabulary of a government investigation report. Some knowledge systems do not transfer cleanly across that kind of boundary. What can be said, carefully and without overstatement, is this. When researchers like David Akers arrived on Toppenish Ridge in the early 1970s with their binoculars and light measuring equipment, they were not discovering something new. They were arriving late to something that had already been observed, interpreted, and incorporated into the landscape's understood character by people who'd been living alongside it for generations. Tribal members who worked as fire lookout observers on the reservation were among the witnesses during the 1970s wave of sightings. Their accounts were consistent with what Vogel and Akers were documenting. The amber and orange lights, the low movement along ridge lines, the occasional behaviour that seemed to respond to human presence. These were not accounts shaped by exposure to UFO culture or by the specific vocabulary of the modern sighting report. They were descriptions of something these observers had seen, in a place they knew well, behaving in ways they found unusual but not entirely unfamiliar. That last part is worth sitting with, not entirely unfamiliar. Some tribal members, when asked about the lights, described them as part of the landscape's normal strangeness, something the ridge did, something that had always been there in the background of life on the reservation. Not frightening, not extraordinary in the way that outside investigators found them extraordinary, but simply present, a feature of the place. That kind of long familiarity with a phenomenon changes how you relate to it. You do not necessarily feel the need to explain it or classify it or write a formal report about it. It is just something the land does, and you live alongside it the way you live alongside the wind or the seasonal flooding of the river. This is not the same as saying that tribal accounts provide mystical confirmation of something supernatural. That framing would be both inaccurate and disrespectful. What it does suggest is something more straightforward, and in some ways more interesting, that the phenomena being observed in the 1970s were not a new occurrence tied to some specific modern cause. They were not the product of a new military program that began in 1971, or a new atmospheric condition that developed in the post-war period, or a new psychological susceptibility in a population that had recently been exposed to UFO media. The accounts from tribal members place these lights in the landscape across a time frame that stretches back well beyond the modern UFO era, which began in earnest only in 1947. If the lights were being noticed and described before 1947, before Kenneth Arnold, before the Air Force's Project Blue Book, before the word UFO existed in its current cultural sense, then whatever they are not a product of that cultural moment. That is a genuinely significant constraint on the possible explanations. It rules out, or at least substantially complicates, any explanation that depends on modern technology, modern military activity, or modern cultural suggestion. Something was happening on Toppenish Ridge before any of those things existed in their current form. There is also the practical matter of the investigation itself. The Yakima Nation reservation is sovereign territory, which means that outside researchers cannot simply arrive and set up equipment wherever they choose. Acres fieldwork in the early 1970s was conducted with the cooperation of Bureau of Indian Affairs personnel and reservation fire control staff, which gave him access that a purely independent researcher would not have had. Later investigators who wanted to establish monitoring equipment on the ridge faced the additional layer of needing to work within the framework of tribal governance and sovereignty. Some accounts from researchers during the 1970s and 1980s mention navigating these relationships carefully, being clear about the purpose of their presence, working with rather than around the people whose land they were on. This is how it should work, and the fact that it sometimes created logistical complications did not make the work less legitimate. It made it more honest. What it also meant, practically, is that sustained long-term monitoring of Toppenish Ridge was difficult to organise. You could not simply lease a patch of land and install a permanent observation station the way you might on private property. The investigation was episodic by necessity, periods of active fieldwork followed by gaps with no continuous record. That episodic quality makes it harder to build the kind of longitudinal dataset that would allow researchers to say with confidence how often the lights appear, under what conditions, in what seasons, at what altitudes. The data that exists is real and carefully gathered, but it is not complete in the way that a properly resourced long-term study would be. Some tribal members, it should be said, had mixed feelings about the outside attention the reservation was receiving in the 1970s. A place being studied by researchers from an outside institution, even a sympathetic and scientifically oriented one like CUFOS, is still a place being studied by outsiders, and that dynamic carries its own history on reservation lands. The relationship between the federal government and the Yakima Nation, shaped by the 1855 treaty and everything that followed it, is not a relationship built on straightforward trust. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, through which Vogel worked, was a federal agency with its own complicated history in relation to tribal communities. The fact that Vogel himself was a careful and respectful observer who maintained good relationships with tribal members and their accounts does not erase the broader context in which that work was happening. None of this changes what was observed, but it is part of understanding why the Yakima investigation unfolded the way it did, why it was limited in certain ways, and why the record that exists is shaped by the specific conditions under which it was gathered. Research happens in a social and political context. The Yakima case is not an exception to that. What is striking, when you step back and look at the full picture, is how the tribal accounts function within the larger body of evidence. They do not add dramatic new details. They do not describe encounters of a kind that goes beyond what the fire lookout observers were seeing. What they add is depth, a sense that the timeline of this phenomenon extends backward far beyond the point where the formal investigation begins. The 1970s fieldwork by Akers and the careful logging by Vogel represent the moment when the observations were formalised. Written down in language that could travel to research institutions and be evaluated by people with scientific training. But the observations themselves were not new. The ridge had been doing whatever the ridge does for a very long time. The notebooks were new. The phenomenon apparently was not. There is something quietly important about that. It suggests that whatever is generating these lights, whether it is geological, atmospheric, genuinely anomalous, or something else entirely, it is stable. It is not a transient event tied to a particular set of conditions that happened to exist briefly in the early 1970s. It is a persistent feature of this specific landscape, documented across different cultural frameworks, different languages, different observational tools, and different centuries. That kind of persistence is unusual. Most unexplained phenomena, when investigated carefully, turn out to be either explained by a conventional cause or found to be less consistent than initial reports suggested. The Yakima lights have not behaved that way. They have continued, and the accounts of their continuation have come from people with no particular reason to coordinate their descriptions. It is also worth noting what the long indigenous history of observation does not tell us. It does not tell us what the lights are. It does not confirm any particular interpretation, not the geological hypothesis, not the extraterrestrial hypothesis, not any of the others. What it tells us is that the phenomenon is old, that it is tied to this specific landscape, and that it has been noticed by people who knew this land better than any outside researcher ever could. Those are important data points. They narrow the field of possible explanations in useful ways, but they do not resolve the question. The question of what is happening over Toppenish Ridge is still open. It was open when Vogel started his logs in 1972. It was open when Hynek assessed the Yakima material as among the most credible he had encountered. It remains open now. What the tribal context adds is a longer frame around that open question. A reminder that the people asking it are not the first to have noticed the thing being asked about, and that the landscape itself has been holding this particular puzzle for longer than any of the investigators have been alive. The next layer of the puzzle, the one that researchers began to examine more carefully as the 1970s continued, had nothing to do with cultural history or spiritual geography. It had to do with the ground itself, the specific geological structure of the Yakima Fold Belt, and what happens, physically, when ancient basalt rock is placed under tectonic stress for millions of years. Because one of the more scientifically interesting proposals for what the lights might be does not require anything anomalous at all. It requires only a very good understanding of how rock behaves when it is compressed, and what kinds of light that compression can produce. That explanation is not simple, and it is not fully proven, but it is grounded in physics rather than speculation, and it begins with the folds in the earth beneath the ridge itself. The Yakima Fold Belt is not a name that comes up often in casual conversation. It does not have the dramatic resonance of the San Andreas Fault or the Cascades, but geologically speaking, it is a genuinely remarkable structure, and once you understand what it is and how it formed, the landscape around Yakima starts to look different. The folds are visible from above, long parallel ridges running roughly east to west across the region, like wrinkles pressed into the surface of the Earth, which is, more or less, exactly what they are. The mechanism that created them is tectonic compression. Over millions of years, the movement of the Juan de Fuca plate against the North American plate has pushed the crust of the Pacific Northwest eastward and inward. The rock, unable to simply slide, buckled. It folded upward into a series of anticlinal ridges, arches of compressed basalt, separated by synclinal valleys. Toppenish Ridge is one of these anticlines. So is Rattlesnake Mountain to the north, and a series of other ridges that give the Yakima region its distinctive corrugated topography. These are not gentle undulations. They are the surface expression of enormous compressive forces that have been operating for roughly 15 million years and have not stopped. Beneath these folds lies the Columbia River Basalt Group, which is one of the most significant geological formations in North America, and one that does not get nearly enough attention outside of geology circles. Between roughly 17 and 6 million years ago, a series of massive volcanic eruptions, not explosive eruptions but effusive ones, floods of lava rather than blasts, covered an area of approximately 210,000 square kilometers across what is now Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. The lava flows stacked on top of each other in layers, some individual flows reaching thicknesses of 30 meters or more. The total volume of basalt produced is estimated at around 210,000 cubic kilometers. That is a number that is almost impossible to visualize. It is enough basalt to cover the entire state of Washington in a layer roughly 50 meters deep. This is the rock that underlies Yakima Valley. It is the rock that has been folded and compressed into the ridges and valleys of the fold belt. And it is the rock that a small but serious group of geophysical researchers began to look at very carefully in the 1970s and 1980s when trying to understand what might be producing the lights over Toppenish Ridge. The hypothesis goes by several names: earth lights, tectonic strain lights, seismic lights, and it has a somewhat complicated history in terms of scientific respectability. The core idea is this: when certain types of rock are placed under mechanical stress, compressed, sheared, or fractured, they can generate electrical charge. This is a well-documented physical phenomenon called the piezoelectric effect, and it occurs in rocks that contain quartz or other crystalline minerals. The basalt of the Columbia River Basalt Group does contain some quartz-bearing minerals, though basalt is not as rich in quartz as granite. More relevant to the tectonic light hypothesis are the fault zones within the fold belt, where rocks of different types are in contact, and where the movement of rock against rock can generate significant electrical and electromagnetic effects. The proposed mechanism runs roughly like this. As tectonic stress builds in the rock, either gradually through the slow compression of the fold belt or more acutely as stress accumulates before a seismic event, electrical charges are generated within the rock and migrate toward the surface. At the surface, or just above it, these charges can ionize the surrounding air, creating a plasma, a region of electrically charged gas that emits light. The resulting phenomenon would appear as a glowing, floating, luminous form. It would move in response to air currents and electrical gradients rather than any mechanical propulsion. It would be silent. It might vary in color depending on the specific gases ionized and the intensity of the charge. It might appear to hover, drift, split, or merge as the underlying electrical conditions changed. The researcher most associated with developing this hypothesis into a serious framework is Paul Devereux, a British writer and researcher who spent decades investigating what he called earth lights, luminous phenomena associated with fault lines and areas of geological stress. Devereux catalogued cases from around the world where persistent light phenomena appeared to correlate with fault line locations, and he argued that Yakima was one of the strongest examples of this correlation. His 1982 book on the subject brought the Earthlights concept to a wider audience, and he specifically discussed the Yakima material as a case where the geography and the reported phenomena aligned in ways that were difficult to dismiss. Around the same time, the neuroscientist Michael Persinger was developing a related but somewhat different framework. Persinger's work focused on the electromagnetic fields produced by tectonic stress and their potential effects on human perception and brain function. He proposed that some reported encounters with unusual phenomena, not just lights, but the full range of anomalous experiences, might be explained by the effects of electromagnetic fields on the temporal lobes of the brain, producing vivid perceptual experiences that felt entirely real to the witness. Persinger's work was controversial and has been challenged on methodological grounds, but the electromagnetic component of his thinking overlapped with the Earthlights hypothesis in ways that kept both ideas in conversation with each other through the 1980s. Now, the Yakima Fold Belt is seismically active. That is not a matter of debate. The region has a documented history of earthquakes, most of them moderate in magnitude, but some significant enough to cause damage. The Yakima Valley sits within the broader Cascadia subduction zone system, one of the most seismically significant geological structures in North America. Closer to the valley itself, there are a number of mapped fault structures within the Fold Belt, including faults associated with Toppenish Ridge specifically. The Toppenish Ridge Fault is a documented structure, a reverse fault running along the south side of the ridge, a product of the same compressive forces that created the fold itself. It has produced earthquakes in the past, and it remains capable of producing them in the future. The presence of active fault structures beneath the primary area of light sightings is the kind of geographical correlation that the Earthlights hypothesis requires. If tectonic stress can produce luminous phenomena, you would expect those phenomena to appear preferentially near fault lines and in areas of active geological compression. Toppenish Ridge checks both boxes. The correlation does not prove the mechanism, but it is not nothing either. There are specific aspects of the Yakima sightings that fit the Earthlights model reasonably well. The amber and orange colour range of the most commonly reported lights is consistent with the emission spectra of ionised nitrogen and oxygen, which are the dominant gases in the lower atmosphere and the ones most likely to be ionised by a low-energy plasma discharge near the ground. The silent movement of the lights, drifting, hovering, accelerating without any mechanical sound, is consistent with a plasma phenomenon driven by electrical and atmospheric gradients rather than propulsion. The tendency of the lights to appear over ridgelines and elevated terrain is also consistent with the model, since fault-related electrical discharges would preferentially emerge at points of surface relief where the rock is under the most complex stress. The phenomenon of lights appearing to emerge from or descend into hillsides, reported by multiple Yakima observers across different years, also has a potential geological explanation. If the light source is a plasma generated by electrical discharge within or just above the rock surface, it might appear to originate from the hillside itself rather than from the sky. A plasma that forms near the ground and then rises would look, from a distance, like something emerging from the earth. One that dissipates near a hillside would look like something entering it. So far, this sounds like a fairly tidy explanation, but there are aspects of the Yakima sightings that the Earthlights hypothesis handles less comfortably, and it is worth being honest about those. The most difficult behaviour to explain geologically is the apparent responsiveness of the lights to human observers, specifically the flashlight response phenomenon documented by both Bill Vogel and David Akers. When an observer shone a flashlight toward one of the light sometimes appeared to react, moving toward the observer, changing its brightness or mimicking the flash pattern. This behaviour is not consistent with a passive plasma phenomenon. A plasma driven by tectonic electrical discharge has no mechanism for detecting and responding to a light signal from a human being. It does not have sensors. It does not process information. If the flashlight response observations are accurate, they describe a behaviour that the geological model simply cannot account for. There are a few ways to approach this. One is to suggest that the flashlight responses were coincidental, that the observers, naturally watching closely for any movement or change, interpreted normal variation in the light's behaviour as a response to their signals. This is a reasonable psychological explanation, and it cannot be entirely ruled out. When you are watching something unusual, and you do something, and then the unusual thing changes, the human brain is strongly inclined to connect those two events as cause and effect, even when the connection may not be real. That is just how perception works. Another approach is to accept the flashlight responses at face value and conclude that they represent a behaviour that the Earthlight's model cannot explain, which means either the geological hypothesis is incomplete, or some of the Yakima lights are something different from what the geological model describes. It is possible that not all the lights over Toppenish Ridge have the same origin. Some sightings might be tectonic plasma phenomena. Others might be something else. A mixed population of phenomena, each with its own explanation, would actually be consistent with the variety of behaviours reported across 50 years of observation. What is also worth noting is that the Earthlight's hypothesis, while scientifically grounded in real physical mechanisms, has not been definitively proven in any specific case. The piezoelectric effect is real. The ability of stressed rock to generate electrical charge is documented in laboratory conditions, but the full chain of events from tectonic stress to atmospheric plasma to visible luminous phenomenon has not been demonstrated in a controlled field setting in a way that would satisfy the most rigorous scientific standards. The correlation between fault lines and light phenomena is suggestive, but correlation is not causation, and the specific mechanisms by which subsurface electrical charge would produce stable, long-duration, visually complex luminous forms at the surface remain incompletely understood. Some geophysicists take the Earthlight's hypothesis seriously as a working model worth investigating. Others are more sceptical, pointing out that basalt is not particularly piezoelectric compared to quartz-rich rock, and that the conditions required to produce visible plasma at the surface from tectonic stress would need to be quite extreme. The debate within the scientific community is real, and it has not been resolved. The Yakima case is interesting precisely because it offers a location where the geological conditions are right for testing the hypothesis. If anyone were to mount a properly resourced long-term geophysical monitoring study of Toppenish Ridge, correlating seismic activity with light phenomenon reports, they might actually be able to gather data that would advance the question one way or another. As of yet, that study has not been done. There is also the question of what the geological explanation, even if partially correct, leaves unaddressed. The Yakima lights have been observed not just over the ridge but across a broader area of the valley and reservation. Some of the most detailed reports describe objects at altitudes and distances inconsistent with the ground-level plasma phenomenon. Some describe objects that move with apparent directionality over long distances, not drifting with air currents, but travelling in consistent directions, changing course, and then travelling in a different direction. These behaviours are harder to attribute to a passive plasma driven by electrical gradients. And then there is the radar question, which the geological model does not touch at all. A plasma phenomenon of the kind described by the Earthlight's hypothesis would have a radar cross-section that depends on its density and the wavelength of the radar being used. Some types of plasma are radar invisible. Others produce detectable returns. The reports from the mid-1970s of radar returns associated with Yakima lights, which will come up in more detail shortly, add a layer of complexity that purely atmospheric or geological explanations have to work hard to accommodate. What the geological framework does, even with all its limitations, is something genuinely useful. It moves the Yakima mystery out of the realm of pure speculation and into the realm of physical hypothesis. It says, here is a mechanism, here is a location, here is a set of conditions that might produce these observations, and here is how you would begin to test whether that is what is happening. That is a more productive place to be than simply noting that the lights are strange and leaving it there. The geological hypothesis is not the answer to the Yakima question, but it is a serious attempt to find one, and the fact that the landscape beneath the ridge genuinely supports the conditions the hypothesis requires is not a coincidence that can be waved away easily. The ridge sits on folded basalt, above a documented fault in one of the most geologically compressed regions in the Pacific Northwest. Whatever is producing the lights, if any single thing is producing all of them, it is doing so in a place where the Earth itself has been under enormous pressure for a very long time. That much, at least, is certain. But while researchers were working through the geological possibilities, the skies above the valley were becoming considerably more crowded with reports. The mid-1970s brought a significant escalation in the frequency and scale of what was being observed, not just by fire lookouts on a quiet ridge, but by pilots, military personnel, and radar operators whose job it was to know exactly what was in the air around them. And some of what they were seeing did not fit any natural framework, geological or otherwise. The year 1975 marked something of a turning point in the Yakima story, not because the lights appeared for the first time, or because they suddenly became more dramatic in some sensational way, but because the circle of people seeing them began to widen in ways that made the whole situation considerably harder to dismiss. Fire lookout observers on Toppenish Ridge had been logging reports for several years by this point. Researchers had visited. Careful notes had been taken. But 1975 and 1976 brought a new category of witness into the record. People whose professional responsibilities required them to know the sky, to interpret what they saw in it accurately, and to report anomalies through official channels. And some of them were reporting things they could not explain. Pilots flying into Yakima Air Terminal, which sits at the north end of the valley at an elevation of about 1,066 feet, began filing reports of unusual lights in the area. These were not casual observers. Commercial and charter pilots are trained to identify other aircraft, to recognize weather phenomena, to understand the visual tricks that night flying can play on the human eye. They know what a landing light looks like from 5 miles away. They know what a weather balloon does in a crosswind. When a pilot files a report describing something that does not match any of those categories, it is at least worth taking seriously, and several pilots operating in and around the Yakima corridor during this period did exactly that. The reports described glowing objects at altitudes inconsistent with their apparent size, objects that did not carry navigation lights, and objects that maneuvered in ways that fixed-wing aircraft simply do not maneuver, including abrupt directional changes at speeds that would be structurally impossible for any known aircraft of that era. The radar question is worth spending some time on, because it changes the nature of the discussion in a meaningful way. Visual sightings, even by credible witnesses, always carry the possibility of perceptual error. The human visual system is not a camera. It is an interpretive system, and it makes mistakes, especially at night, especially when the observer is already primed to notice unusual things. Radar is different. Radar does not have expectations. It does not get tired or excited or confused by context. It sends a signal out and measures what comes back. And during the peak period of 1975 and 1976, there were reports of radar returns in the Yakima area that did not correspond to any tracked aircraft. McCord Air Force Base, located near Tacoma, roughly 130 miles to the northwest, was operating air defense radar systems during this period as part of the broader NORAD network. The relationship between specific Yakima area visual sightings and any McCord radar data from this period is not fully documented in publicly available records, and it is important to be precise about that rather than overstating the case. What is documented is that the general region of central and western Washington produced radar anomalies during the mid-1970s that attracted attention from air defense personnel, and that the Yakima area was within the coverage zone of multiple radar installations. Some researchers who investigated the Yakima wave in the 1970s reported being told by sources within the military that radar returns had been recorded in association with specific visual events, though the documentary evidence for individual incidents is fragmentary, and in some cases relies on accounts that cannot be independently verified. What can be said with more confidence is that the Yakima Training Center, the large US Army military reservation that occupies a substantial area of land to the east and north of the city of Yakima, was and remains an active military training installation. At roughly 327,000 acres, it is one of the largest military training areas in the western United States, and it has been used continuously for field training, weapons testing and maneuver exercises for decades. The proximity of the training center to the areas where the most concentrated sightings were occurring is something that almost every investigator who looked at Yakima had to address, because the obvious question is whether military activity on that reservation could account for what people were seeing. The answer, frustratingly, is some of it, possibly, but not all of it, and not the most interesting parts. Flares are used in military training exercises, and flares can produce glowing amber and orange light at low altitudes. Illumination rounds fired from artillery create descending lights that can be disorienting to an observer who does not know what they are looking at. Helicopters operating without standard navigation lights, which happens during certain types of night training, can appear as unexplained moving lights. These are all legitimate explanations for a subset of what was reported in the Yakima area, and it would be intellectually dishonest to ignore them. The training center's presence in the region means that a baseline of unusual aerial activity was always present, and some percentage of the reported sightings almost certainly reflects that. But here is the complication. Military personnel at the Yakima Training Center were themselves among the witnesses reporting unexplained objects during this period. Soldiers and officers stationed at or passing through the installation described seeing lights that did not correspond to any exercise they were aware of, moving in ways inconsistent with the training activities they knew were scheduled. When the people who are conducting the military activities are also seeing things they cannot account for, the military explanation starts to carry less weight, at least for those specific incidents. It does not rule out classified programs operating without the knowledge of personnel at the training center level, and that is a real possibility that cannot be dismissed. But it does complicate the simple narrative that everything observed in the Yakima area during the 1970s can be traced back to a known military source. One of the more carefully documented incidents from this peak period occurred in 1975, and it is worth describing in some detail because of the number of observers involved and the duration of the event. On a clear night in the late summer, multiple observers positioned on or near Toppenish Ridge reported a glowing object that appeared over the southern horizon and moved slowly northward across the ridge. The object was described as roughly spherical, amber to orange in colour, and significantly brighter than any star or planet visible that night. What distinguished this incident from a simple light-in-the-sky report was its duration and its behaviour. The object remained visible for over 40 minutes. During that time, it changed direction at least twice, at one point appearing to reverse its course and move back toward the south, before turning again and descending toward the ridgeline. It made no sound that any of the observers could detect, despite conditions that would have allowed sound to carry clearly. At no point did it display navigation lights or any of the standard visual markers that would identify it as a known aircraft. When it finally disappeared, it did so by appearing to descend below the ridgeline rather than by moving off into the distance. 40 minutes is a long time. It is long enough that the observers had time to use binoculars, to compare observations with each other, to rule out obvious explanations in real time. It is long enough that the object's behaviour could be tracked and noted with some precision. And the directional changes are the detail that resist the simplest explanations. A flare descends, a balloon drifts with the wind. A conventional aircraft follows a flight path. An object that travels in one direction, stops, reverses and then descends in a controlled fashion, is behaving in a way that none of those categories accounts for. The question of declassified documents and FOIA materials related to this period is one that UFO researchers have spent considerable effort pursuing, with results that are genuinely mixed. The Freedom of Information Act has produced a substantial body of documents related to UFO investigations by various government agencies, and some of those documents touch on the Pacific Northwest in general terms. The Defense Intelligence Agency, the NSA, and the Air Force have all released materials acknowledging that unusual aerial phenomena were being tracked and documented during the 1970s. Whether any of those materials specifically reference the Yakima Valley by name, in connection with the sightings that Vogel, Akers, and others were documenting, is a more complicated question. Some researchers have reported finding references in released documents to monitoring activity in the central Washington region during the mid-1970s, but the documents themselves are often heavily redacted, and the connection to the specific Yakima sighting wave requires inference rather than direct citation. What the documentary record does establish is that the US government was paying attention to UFO reports from credible sources during this period, that radar returns associated with unidentified objects were being logged in multiple locations across the country, and that the official position of studied indifference was not always consistent with what was actually happening at the operational level. Whether any of that official attention was specifically directed at the Yakima Valley, and what conclusions, if any, were reached, remains unclear. There is also something worth noting about the broader military context of 1975 specifically. That year saw a remarkable wave of intrusions at nuclear weapons storage facilities across the northern United States and Canada. Loring Air Force Base in Maine, Wurtsmith in Michigan, Malmstrom in Montana, Minot in North Dakota, and others. In each case, unidentified objects were reported over or near facilities where nuclear weapons were stored, and in several cases security teams were scrambled in response. The incidents were serious enough that a message was sent through military channels acknowledging the pattern and requesting that installations report any further intrusions. This is documented in declassified records. The Yakima Training Center did not house nuclear weapons, but the broader pattern of 1975 is relevant context for understanding why radar operators and military personnel in the region might have been paying particular attention to unidentified aerial objects that year, and why some reports from the Yakima area during this period may have received more institutional attention than the public record reflects. None of this resolves what was actually in the air above Toppenish Ridge. It does, however, establish that the mid-1970s Yakima wave was not occurring in isolation. It was happening during a period of heightened concern about unidentified objects near sensitive military installations in a region that contained a major military training reservation, within radar coverage of multiple air defense systems, and against a backdrop of documented government interest in exactly the kind of phenomena that Yakima observers were reporting. That convergence of factors does not prove anything, but it does suggest that the Yakima sightings were embedded in a larger context that has never been fully examined in a single, coherent investigation. The fire lookouts on Toppenish Ridge continued their observations through 1976, adding to a log that by this point stretched across several years and hundreds of individual entries. Vogel's careful documentation remained the spine of the record. Times, durations, directions, behaviours, all noted with the same methodical attention he had brought to the work from the beginning. Other observers contributed their own accounts, and the consistency across those accounts, made by people who were not always in contact with each other and who were observing from different positions, remained one of the most striking features of the whole body of evidence. The lights that appeared over the ridge in 1976 looked and behaved the way the lights in 1972 had looked and behaved. Whatever was producing them, it was not random. It had a character, a kind of consistency that persisted across years and across the changing roster of people watching. By the late 1970s, the Yakima wave had attracted enough attention within the UFO research community that it was being discussed at conferences and cited in publications as one of the most sustained and carefully documented cases in American history. Hynek's assessment that the Yakima sightings were among the most credible he had encountered carried weight in those discussions, given his background and his history of skepticism. The fact that a scientist who had spent years as the Air Force's official UFO debunker found the Yakima evidence compelling was not something that could be easily set aside. But the late 1970s were also the beginning of a transition in how UFO phenomena were being discussed publicly and culturally, and that transition would affect how the Yakima story developed in the decade that followed. The careful, observation-based approach that Akers and Vogel had represented was about to share space with a very different kind of conversation, one that was louder, more dramatic, and considerably less precise. The Valley kept producing reports through the changing cultural weather of the 1980s, but the way those reports were received, and the kind of attention they attracted, was shifting in ways that would complicate the picture considerably. To understand Yakima fully, you have to step back from the ridge for a moment and look at the wider map. Because the valley does not exist in isolation, geographically or historically, and the sightings that accumulated there through the 1970s were not happening in a region that had been quiet before. The Pacific Northwest has a long and genuinely unusual relationship with aerial phenomena, and Yakima sits inside that relationship in a way that is worth slowing down to consider. The date that most people would reach for first is June 24th, 1947. That was the afternoon when a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying his single-engine Corsair near Mount Rainier, roughly 100 miles northwest of Yakima, searching for a downed military transport that had been reported in the area. Arnold was an experienced pilot, a businessman who flew regularly across the region, and by his own account, a careful and grounded observer. What he reported seeing that afternoon became one of the most consequential accounts in the history of aerial phenomena. 9 objects flying in a loose echelon formation, moving at a speed he estimated at around 1,700 miles per hour, behaving in a way he described as like a saucer skipping across water. The phrase the press attached to his description, flying saucers, entered the language almost immediately, and within weeks reports of similar objects were coming in from across the country. The modern UFO era, as a cultural and investigative phenomenon, is generally dated to that afternoon above the Cascades. Arnold's sighting was not over Yakima, but it was close enough that the geography connects them, and the Cascade Range that forms the western wall of the Yakima Valley is the same range he was flying along when he made his observation. The mountain landscape that frames Yakima to the west is the same landscape that framed the event that started everything. That is not evidence of anything in particular, but it is a geographical fact worth holding on to. A few days after Arnold's report, a separate and considerably stranger series of events unfolded near Maury Island, a small island in Puget Sound south of Seattle. A harbour patrol boat captain named Harold Dahl reported that he and his crew had observed 6 donut-shaped objects over the water, one of which appeared to eject material that fell onto his boat and injured his son. The Maury Island incident is murky and contested in ways that Arnold's sighting is not. There are questions about Dahl's credibility and about what actually happened, but it is part of the same concentrated burst of Pacific Northwest reports from the summer of 1947, a summer that seems in retrospect to have been unusually active across the entire region. What followed over the next 2 decades was a steady accumulation of reports from Washington, Oregon, and Northern California that gave the Pacific Northwest a reputation within UFO research circles as one of the most consistently active zones in the country. The geography offers some obvious contributing factors. The Cascade Range creates dramatic atmospheric conditions, temperature inversions, lenticular clouds, unusual light refraction, that can produce optical effects not easily explained by casual observers. The long, clear summer nights at higher latitudes give people more hours of dark sky to watch. The region's history of aerospace and military activity means that classified aircraft testing has been a genuine presence in the sky for decades, providing a plausible conventional explanation for some reports while simultaneously raising questions about others. The military dimension of the Pacific Northwest is not a small detail. The region contains a remarkable concentration of installations and sensitive sites. McCord Air Force Base near Tacoma, Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, the Bangor Submarine Base on Hood Canal, Fairchild Air Force Base near Spokane. These are major facilities with significant operational activity, and the airspace above the Pacific Northwest has never been a quiet or uncomplicated place. Pilots, both military and civilian, have been navigating complex and often classified traffic patterns across the region for generations. Some portion of the unusual aerial observations reported from Washington state over the decades can almost certainly be attributed to military aircraft, operating under conditions of secrecy, and that is a reasonable and important caveat to keep in mind. But Hanford is the detail that tends to stop people when they look at the map of the region and start thinking about what Yakima is surrounded by. The Hanford site sits roughly 50 miles east of Yakima, on the banks of the Columbia River in the high desert of central Washington. It was established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project, and the plutonium produced there was used in the Trinity test device and in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. After the war, Hanford continued as the primary plutonium production facility for the American nuclear arsenal through the Cold War, eventually operating 9 nuclear reactors and becoming one of the most significant and most contaminated nuclear sites in the Western Hemisphere. The scale of what happened at Hanford is genuinely difficult to absorb. At its peak, the site employed tens of thousands of workers and produced the plutonium for the majority of American nuclear warheads. The cleanup effort that began after the Cold War ended is still ongoing, expected to take decades more and cost hundreds of billions of dollars. The proximity of Hanford to Yakima is one of those facts that different people interpret very differently depending on their starting assumptions. For researchers who believe that UFO activity tends to cluster near nuclear facilities, a hypothesis that gained traction partly because of the documented 1975 incidents at nuclear weapons storage sites mentioned earlier, the 50-mile distance between Hanford and the Toppenish Ridge sightings is significant. The argument is not precise or quantifiable, but the pattern of reported phenomena near nuclear sites is consistent enough across enough different locations that serious researchers have noted it repeatedly. Hynek himself observed the correlation, as did Jacques Vallée, the French-American astronomer and computer scientist who became one of the most rigorous and unconventional thinkers in the field. For skeptics, the Hanford proximity is less meaningful. 50 miles is not a short distance, and Hanford's location on the other side of a significant ridgeline from Yakima means the two sites are not in direct line of sight. The argument that nuclear facilities attract anomalous aerial phenomena is intriguing but not established with anything approaching scientific rigour, and the correlation, while noted, could reflect observer bias as much as genuine clustering. People near nuclear sites may simply be more alert to unusual activity in the sky, or more likely to report it, rather than unusual activity actually being more frequent there. What is harder to dismiss is the cumulative character of what Yakima represents geographically. When you draw a circle around the valley and look at what it contains and what surrounds it, the picture is genuinely unusual. To the west, the Cascade Range and the Arnold Sighting Corridor. To the east, Hanford and the Columbia River nuclear landscape. To the south, the Yakima Reservation and the Toppenish Ridge focal point. Within the valley itself, the Yakima Training Center, a military reservation covering nearly 330,000 acres that has been used for artillery, armor and aviation training for decades. And underneath all of it, the Yakima Fold Belt geology with its compressed basalt and its fault systems running through the same ground where the lights have been appearing for 50 years. Any one of those factors might be interesting on its own. Taken together, they make Yakima something close to a case study in how multiple overlapping contexts can create a location that is genuinely difficult to analyze cleanly. There is no single lens through which the valley comes into focus. Military activity, geological anomaly, indigenous land with a long history of unusual observation, proximity to nuclear infrastructure, and position within a region already known for aerial phenomena. These things are all true simultaneously, and they pull in different analytical directions. The Pacific Northwest context also helps explain why Yakima attracted the attention it did from serious researchers rather than just enthusiasts. Arnold's 1947 sighting had made the region a place that UFO investigators watched carefully. The density of credible reports from Washington, Oregon through the 1950s and 1960s meant that when a fire control officer on the Yakima Reservation began logging systematic observations in the early 1970s, there was already an established research infrastructure, people like Hynek, institutions like CUFOS, that was positioned to take those logs seriously. Yakima did not have to build credibility from scratch. It was entering a conversation that the Pacific Northwest had already been having for 25 years. There's also something worth saying about the specific quality of Pacific Northwest observation culture that may be relevant here. The region has a long tradition of outdoor work, forestry, agriculture, fishing, fire management, that puts large numbers of people outside at night and in remote terrain, watching the sky as a matter of practical necessity rather than curiosity. Fire lookouts, in particular, represent a category of observer that is almost uniquely qualified to notice and record unusual aerial phenomena. They are trained to watch the sky carefully. They are isolated from the distractions of populated areas. They have reference points that allow them to estimate distance and direction accurately, and they keep logs as a professional habit. The concentration of fire lookout reports from the Yakima area in the early 1970s is not simply a coincidence of location. It reflects the fact that the Yakima Reservation's fire management system put exactly the right kind of observers in exactly the right place to notice what was happening over Toppenish Ridge. Whether the Pacific Northwest produces more genuine anomalous phenomena than other regions, or simply produces more careful documentation of phenomena that occur everywhere, is a question that cannot be answered with the available evidence. The honest position is that the region has historically had both more observers of the right kind and more reasons for unusual aerial activity, military, atmospheric, geological, and that disentangling those factors from each other is genuinely difficult work that has not been done systematically. What the Pacific Northwest context does provide is a sense of scale. The Yakima sightings were not a local curiosity that happened to attract a little attention. They were part of a regional pattern with roots going back to the very beginning of the modern UFO era, occurring in a landscape that contains multiple potential contributing factors, investigated by researchers who were aware of that broader context and who chose to focus on Yakima specifically because the evidence there was more consistent and more carefully documented than almost anywhere else in the region. Hynek's assessment that Yakima was among the most credible cases he had encountered was not made in a vacuum. He had spent decades reviewing UFO reports from across the country and from around the world. He had seen what careful documentation looked like and what sloppy documentation looked like, and he had spent enough time in the field to know the difference between a location that was genuinely producing something worth examining and a location that was simply generating noise. His judgment that Yakima belonged in the first category was informed by that entire body of experience and by the specific character of the Pacific Northwest as a region he had been paying attention to since at least the early days of Project Blue Book. The valley, then, is not just a valley. It is a node in a larger network of phenomena, history and geography that extends across the entire Pacific Northwest and connects backward in time to the summer of 1947 and forward to questions that are still being asked by researchers and government agencies in the present day. Understanding why Yakima matters requires holding all of that context at once, which is not always easy, but is the only way to see the full picture. And the picture was about to get more complicated, because as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, the cultural frame around UFO phenomena was changing in ways that would affect how the Yakima story developed, what kinds of reports were being made, how researchers responded to them, and how the careful observational work of figures like Vogel and Akers fit into a conversation that was becoming louder, stranger, and considerably harder to navigate with the same methodical patience that had defined the early years of the investigation. The late 1970s had been a period of relatively disciplined inquiry. The people doing the serious work, Vogel with his logs, Akers with his instruments, the researchers connected to CUFOS, had operated within a framework that prioritised careful observation over dramatic interpretation. They were asking small, specific questions. What time did the light appear? Which direction was it moving? How long did it last? Did it respond to external stimulus? That kind of methodical patience is harder to maintain than it sounds, especially when the thing you're watching does not fit neatly into any existing category. But the researchers who had established the Yakima investigation in its early years were, by temperament and training, the kind of people who could sit with uncertainty without immediately reaching for an answer that felt satisfying. That disposition began to matter more and more as the 1980s arrived, and the broader UFO conversation started moving in a different direction. The shift happened gradually, and it was driven by several things at once. The 1980 publication of Bud Hopkins' book Missing Time brought the abduction narrative into mainstream UFO discourse in a way it had never quite been before. Whitley Strieber's Communion followed in 1987 and became a genuine bestseller, introducing millions of readers to detailed, visceral accounts of close contact with non-human entities, television specials, tabloid coverage, and a growing cottage industry of abduction researchers created a cultural environment in which the most dramatic and personal accounts received the most attention. The careful, instrument-based field observation that had characterized the early Yakima work was not the kind of story that fit easily into that new landscape. Glowing amber spheres over a basalt ridge, logged at 2 a.m. by a fire control officer, did not have the same narrative pull as a person describing being taken from their bedroom, and so, somewhat inevitably, the methodical documentation that had made Yakima credible began to receive less attention, while a different kind of report started filtering in from the valley. Through the early and mid-1980s, sightings in the Yakima area continued. The lights over Toppenish Ridge did not stop, but the reports that were reaching investigators and eventually the press were increasingly different in character from what Vogel and Akers had documented in the early 1970s. Some witnesses were now describing not just lights, but structured objects, craft with defined edges, with visible features, with apparent windows or panels. A smaller number of reports included closer encounters, individuals who described objects at very low altitude, near enough to feel heat or hear a low vibration. And a handful of reports from the reservation and surrounding areas described what researchers called physical trace cases, locations on the ground where vegetation appeared scorched, soil appeared disturbed, or unusual residue was found in the aftermath of a sighting. These cases were harder to evaluate than the light observations, partly because the physical evidence was rarely preserved carefully, and partly because the chain of custody for any such evidence in the 1980s UFO field was, to put it gently, not always rigorous. It is worth pausing here to be honest about what this shift represented. Some of the new reports from the 1980s may have reflected genuine changes in what was being observed. It is possible that the phenomena, whatever their origin, were presenting differently in some cases, or that witnesses with closer proximity were seeing things that the ridgetop observers at greater distance had not been positioned to notice. That is a legitimate possibility and should not be dismissed. But it is also true that the cultural context of UFO reporting in the 1980s created strong incentives, not necessarily conscious ones, to describe experiences in ways that matched the dominant narratives of the era. People read the same books, watch the same specials, absorb the same frameworks. When you're trying to describe something genuinely unusual, and the only available vocabulary comes from a cultural moment saturated with abduction narratives and structured craft accounts, it is very difficult to know how much of your description reflects what you actually saw, and how much reflects the interpretive lens you brought to the experience. Researchers who had been through the careful fieldwork of the 1970s were aware of this problem, and some of them said so directly. The figures connected to CUFOS who'd been involved in the early Yakima investigation did not simply abandon the area in the 1980s. Several continued to document reports from the valley, and they continued to apply the same standards of evaluation they had used from the beginning. What they found was a mixed picture. Some of the 1980s reports from Yakima held up well under scrutiny. They came from credible witnesses. The described behaviours were consistent with what had been logged in earlier years, and there was no obvious conventional explanation. Others did not hold up as well, showing signs of embellishment, internal inconsistency, or influence from the abduction literature that made them difficult to evaluate independently. The researchers who were doing this work were not trying to debunk the 1980s reports wholesale. They were trying to apply the same filter that had made the 1970s documentation valuable, separating what could be confirmed from what could not, and being clear about the difference. In a field that was becoming increasingly polarised between true believers and aggressive debunkers, that middle position was genuinely difficult to maintain. One of the persistent challenges of the 1980s Yakima documentation was the question of access. The core sighting area, Toppenish Ridge and the surrounding reservation land, remained under the jurisdiction of the Yakima Nation, and the complicated relationship between outside researchers and tribal authorities had not become simpler with time. Some investigators had established working relationships with individual tribal members and fire management personnel that allowed for continued observation. Others found the access more restricted, particularly as the UFO field's growing sensationalism made tribal officials understandably cautious about what kind of attention their land was attracting. The reservation was not a research site to be used as investigators saw fit. It was home to a community of people who had their own relationship with the phenomena and their own reasons for engaging with or declining outside interest. The best researchers of the period understood this and worked accordingly. The less careful ones sometimes did not, and the friction that resulted made systematic fieldwork harder for everyone. There were individuals during this period who continued to do serious work in the valley. Researchers affiliated with CUFOS and with the Mutual UFO Network, known as MUFON, maintained files on Yakima reports through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Some conducted on-site investigations when specific incidents warranted it. The pattern they documented was broadly consistent with what had been established in the early 1970s. Lights over the ridge, concentrated in the Toppenish area, behaving in ways that did not match conventional aircraft, persisting across seasons and years without obvious explanation. The 1980s did not produce a dramatic rupture in the Yakima record. The phenomena, if that is what they were, appeared to continue more or less as they had been. What changed was the investigative environment around them. The trace cases that emerged in the 1980s deserve a careful mention, because they represent a category of evidence that is both more concrete and more problematic than light observations. In a handful of documented instances from the reservation and nearby areas, witnesses reported finding physical alterations at locations associated with sightings, scorched circles of vegetation, typically a few meters in diameter, soil that appeared compacted or fused in ways that seemed inconsistent with normal ground conditions. In at least one case documented from the mid-1980s, samples were collected and sent for laboratory analysis. Though the results were inconclusive, the composition of the affected soil was not dramatically different from surrounding soil, and no definitive causal mechanism was established. These cases attracted attention precisely because physical evidence, if genuine, represents something that cannot be entirely attributed to misperception or cultural influence. But the chain of evidence in most trace cases from this period was weak enough that they cannot be cited as proof of anything specific. They are data points in a file that remains open, not conclusions. What the 1980s ultimately did to the Yakima story was complicated. The early 1970s investigation had a kind of clarity to it. Careful observers, methodical documentation, a specific geographic focus, and a research infrastructure that prioritised accuracy over drama. The 1980s introduced noise into that signal. More reports, more variety, more cultural contamination, and a broader investigative community that ranged from serious to credulous. The core of the Yakima record, the documented observations from Toppenish Ridge, the Acker's fieldwork, the Vogel logs, remained intact and remained credible. But it was now surrounded by a larger body of material that was harder to evaluate and that made the overall picture messier. For a researcher trying to understand what was happening in the Yakima Valley, the 1980s did not make the job easier. There is something almost poignant about this period, if you think about it from the perspective of someone like Vogel or the investigators who had spent years doing careful work in difficult conditions. They had built something genuinely valuable, a documented record of unusual phenomena in a specific location, observed by qualified witnesses, supported by instrument readings, assessed by one of the most respected scientific figures in the field. And then the broader conversation moved away from that kind of work, towards something louder and less careful, and the careful work became harder to hear. That is not a criticism of everyone who reported experiences in the 1980s. Many of those people were describing something real to them. It is simply an observation about how investigative momentum works, and how cultural context shapes not just what gets reported, but what gets taken seriously. By the late 1980s, Yakima was still producing reports. The ridge was still there, the lights were still being seen, and a small number of dedicated researchers were still writing things down. But the period of intensive, instrument-supported fieldwork that had defined the early years of the investigation had not been replicated. No one had returned to Toppenish Ridge with the same systematic commitment that Akers had brought in 1972 and 1973. The equipment that had been briefly installed on the ridge, cameras, light meters, basic monitoring instruments, had not been maintained or upgraded. The investigation had, in a sense, stalled at the level of documentation without advancing to the level of sustained physical monitoring that might have produced more definitive answers. This is one of the genuinely frustrating aspects of the Yakima case, viewed from the present. The early 1970s established that something was worth investigating seriously. The mid-1970s peak wave confirmed that the phenomena were consistent and recurring. The involvement of Hynek, one of the most credible figures in the field, lent the investigation a legitimacy that should have attracted sustained institutional support. And yet the follow-through never quite materialized at the scale the evidence arguably warranted. The 1980s cultural shift is part of the explanation, but only part. Funding, access, and the sheer logistical difficulty of maintaining a long-term observation post on reservation land in a remote area also played roles. The gap between what the Yakima evidence suggested and what the investigative response actually delivered is one of the quiet disappointments of the case. What the 1980s left behind then was a Yakima record that was richer in raw volume but more uneven in quality. The solid foundation of the early years remained solid. The new material required more careful sorting, and the ridge itself, as it always had, continued to sit quietly above the valley floor, with whatever was happening on its slopes and in the air above it, continuing more or less regardless of whether anyone was watching carefully enough to write it down. That specificity of place, the ridge as a recurring focal point across decades, is something that has never been fully explained, and it is the kind of detail that becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it. Because if you are going to understand the Yakima Valley as a phenomenon rather than just a collection of individual sightings, the ridge is where that understanding has to begin. Toppenish Ridge itself deserves more than the passing mentions it has received so far, because if you spend any time with the Yakima case, you start to realize that the ridge is not just a backdrop. It is the story. Almost every significant documented sighting from the early 1970s onward comes back to this ridge in some way, as the location of the observation, as the direction of the object, as the apparent source of the light, or as the place where the phenomenon seemed to terminate. Understanding what the ridge actually is, physically and geographically, turns out to be essential to understanding why the Yakima Valley became what it became. Toppenish Ridge runs roughly east to west for something close to 20 miles. Its elevation reaches approximately 3,000 feet at its higher points, which does not make it dramatic by Cascade standards. The mountains to the west rise considerably higher, but it is enough to give the ridge a commanding position over the valley floor below. Standing on the ridge on a clear night, you can see an enormous expanse of the valley spread out to the north. The city lights of Yakima in the distance, the dark lines of irrigation canals, the flat geometry of orchards and hop fields. The sky from up there feels very large. The horizon is wide, and because the ridge is elevated above most of the valley's light pollution, the darkness on its south-facing slopes can be quite complete. The ridge sits entirely within the Yakima Reservation, which is a fact with practical consequences. Access is controlled. Outsiders cannot simply drive up and set up equipment without permission. During the 1970s, researchers like David Akers were able to establish observation posts partly because they had developed working relationships with the Bureau of Indian Affairs personnel and to some extent with tribal members who were themselves interested in what was happening. But that access was never guaranteed, and it was never unlimited. The ridge's position within sovereign land meant that any sustained monitoring program depended on maintaining those relationships, which added a layer of complexity that purely logistical investigations do not typically face. The specific lookout stations on the ridge were the original observation platforms. These were simple structures, small wooden towers or cabins positioned at high points along the ridge to give fire control officers a clear view of the surrounding terrain. They were staffed during fire season, which in eastern Washington runs roughly from late spring through early autumn. It was during these staffing periods that the most consistent observations were made, because the lookouts were occupied by people whose job was to watch the landscape carefully and report what they saw. Bill Vogel, working as a fire control officer, understood that the lookout staff represented an unusual resource: trained observers with long hours of uninterrupted sky watching, minimal distraction, and a professional obligation to document what they noticed. The fire lookout at Satis Peak, which sits near the western end of Toppenish Ridge, became one of the primary observation points during the early investigation. Akers used this location during his fieldwork in 1972 and 1973, and it offered a particularly good sight line across the length of the ridge and down into the valley below. From Satis Peak, an observer could watch a substantial section of the ridge's topography: the draws and gullies, the basalt outcroppings, the patches of scrub vegetation, and could track an object moving along the ridge from a position of elevation. This mattered because it reduced the chance of confusing a ground-level light with an airborne one, or of misjudging an object's altitude due to terrain interference. What the lookout observers consistently reported, across multiple seasons and multiple observers, was that the light seemed to originate from or near the ridge itself. Not from the sky above it, as you might expect from aircraft or satellites, but from the ridge's surface or from just above the terrain. Objects were described as emerging from hillsides, moving along the contour of the ground, and then ascending or disappearing. This is a detail that recurs often enough in the Yakima records to be worth taking seriously, because it is not the kind of detail that fits neatly into any conventional explanation. Aircraft do not emerge from hillsides. Weather phenomena do not typically follow terrain contours in the way described. The behaviour, if accurately reported, suggests something interacting with the landscape in an unusual way. The geology beneath the ridge is relevant here, and it connects back to the broader geological character of the region that we touched on earlier. Toppenish Ridge is one of the anticlinal ridges of the Yakima Fold Belt, a structure formed by tectonic compression where layers of Columbia River basalt have been pushed upward into a long, narrow arch. The basalt in this area is not a simple uniform layer. It is fractured, folded, and cut through by fault systems, some of which are still seismically active. The ridge itself sits above a complex of fault structures that run roughly parallel to its long axis. This is the kind of geological setting that researchers like Paul Devereaux and Michael Persinger pointed to when developing the Earthlights hypothesis, the idea that piezoelectric stress in rock under tectonic pressure can produce electrical discharges capable of generating visible plasma phenomena. The mechanism, briefly, works something like this. Quartz-bearing rock under mechanical stress generates an electrical charge through the piezoelectric effect, the same basic principle that makes a lighter spark when you click it. In large volumes of stressed rock, this charge can become substantial enough to ionize the surrounding air, creating a glowing plasma that can move, change shape, and respond to electromagnetic conditions in ways that might look, from a distance, like an intelligently controlled object. The plasma can be spherical, can change colour from white to orange to red depending on its energy state, and can move along terrain features if those features correspond to electrical pathways in the underlying rock. This is not a fringe idea exactly. Earthquake lights, luminous phenomena associated with seismic activity, are a well-documented real phenomenon. There are photographs and video recordings of them from multiple countries, and the scientific literature accepts their existence even if the exact mechanism is still debated. What is more contested is whether similar phenomena can occur in the absence of an active earthquake, driven instead by lower-level tectonic strain. The Yakima Fold Belt is seismically active enough that this is not an implausible scenario. The region experiences regular small earthquakes, and the fault systems beneath Toppenish Ridge represent zones of ongoing geological stress. The Earthlight's framework would account for several of the most consistent features of the Yakima observations: the orange and amber coloration, the spherical form, the low altitude and terrain-following behaviour, the apparent emergence from hillsides, the silence, and even the long duration of some events. Glowing plasma phenomena can persist for minutes or longer under the right conditions. They can appear to hover, drift, and accelerate. They can be affected by electromagnetic fields in ways that might, under some circumstances, produce what looks like a response to a flashlight signal. Not because the phenomenon is intelligent, but because it is electrically sensitive. But the Earthlight's explanation has limits, and it is worth being clear about what they are. The flashlight response behaviour is the most difficult to account for through purely geological means. If a plasma phenomenon were responding to the electromagnetic output of a handheld flashlight, that would require a level of sensitivity and a proximity that seems at odds with what was being observed. Objects at distances of hundreds of meters reacting to a light source with relatively modest electromagnetic output. Some researchers have suggested that the response might be coincidental, or that observers were pattern matching, seeing a response because they expected one. This is a reasonable caution. Human perception is genuinely prone to finding patterns that confirm expectations, especially in low-light conditions with ambiguous stimuli. The apparent intelligent behaviour, objects that seemed to track observers, respond to signals or make directional changes that looked purposeful, is the part of the Yakima record that the geological explanation handles least convincingly. It is also the part that is hardest to verify, because it depends on the perceptual interpretation of witnesses, rather than on instrument readings. Akers' formal reports are careful on this point. He documented what was observed without claiming to know what it meant, and he was notably reluctant to attribute intent or intelligence to what he was seeing. That restraint is one of the things that makes his work credible. But the observations themselves, the apparent reactions, the apparent tracking, are there in the record and they are not easily dismissed. The isolation and elevation of the ridge also raise the alternative explanation that occasionally surfaces in discussions of the Yakima case, that the ridge, precisely because of its position within reservation land and its relative inaccessibility, might have been used for covert activity of some kind. The Yakima Training Center, the large army reservation to the east, was and remains an active military installation. Classified testing programs have used remote terrain in the American West before. The Nevada test site and the various operations conducted in the desert Southwest are well-documented examples of this. It is not inherently unreasonable to ask whether some of what was seen over Toppenish Ridge in the 1970s might have involved experimental aircraft or technology being tested in a location that offered both isolation and proximity to military infrastructure. The problem with this explanation is the same problem it always faces. It requires a sustained multi-decade covert program operating over a relatively well-observed area, producing consistent phenomena that were logged by multiple independent witnesses, including Bureau of Indian Affairs officials, scientific investigators, and tribal members. Covert programs tend to avoid sustained attention rather than generate it, and the specific characteristics of what was reported, silent glowing spheres emerging from hillsides, not high-altitude aircraft or drone-like objects, do not map naturally onto any known or suspected military technology from the 1970s. That does not rule it out, but it makes it a less satisfying fit for the evidence. Some researchers in the 1970s and 1980s did attempt to install monitoring equipment on the ridge. The efforts were modest by any serious scientific standard: cameras with automatic triggers, simple electromagnetic sensors, basic photographic traps. The results were limited. A few photographs were obtained that showed anomalous light sources, but the image quality and documentation were insufficient to draw firm conclusions. The equipment was not maintained consistently, and the logistical challenges of keeping instruments operational on a remote ridge in variable weather conditions without a permanent presence proved difficult to overcome. This is one of the genuinely unfortunate aspects of the Yakima investigation. The location was specific enough, and the phenomena consistent enough, that a properly resourced monitoring program might have produced meaningful data. But that program never materialized. The specificity of the ridge is actually one of the things that makes the Yakima case more tractable in principle than many UFO hotspots. A lot of reported UFO concentrations are geographically diffuse: a general region, a county, a stretch of highway. Toppenish Ridge is a specific landform. It has a defined geology, a known fault structure, a documented history of observation, and a relatively limited access population. If you wanted to design a study of whatever is happening there, you could. You would know where to put your instruments. You would have historical records to compare against. You would have a community of potential witnesses with a long institutional memory. The case is, in that sense, more testable than it might appear, and yet it has not been tested at the level the evidence suggests it deserves. No university geology department has conducted a sustained piezoelectric monitoring program along the Toppenish fault system. No aerospace engineering team has set up a proper multi-camera array on the ridge with calibrated light measuring instruments. No government agency, as far as the public record shows, has formally investigated the ridge as a specific location of interest, even as the broader UAP conversation has gained institutional traction in recent years. The ridge sits there, within its specific geological and geographical context, producing reports that have been accumulating for more than 50 years, and the systematic investigation that might finally produce a clear answer has simply not happened. There is something almost puzzling about this, if you think about it practically. The Yakima case is one of the best documented UFO hotspots in American history. It has a named geographic focal point. It has credible early investigators. It has a plausible natural explanation in the Earthlights hypothesis that could in principle be tested with the right instruments. And it has an ongoing record of reports that suggest the phenomena, whatever they are, have not stopped. The combination of those factors should make it an attractive target for serious investigation. The fact that it has not attracted that investigation tells you something about how the broader conversation around these phenomena works, or perhaps about how it fails to work. What the ridge represents in the end is a kind of standing question, a specific place on a specific piece of land where something has been observed repeatedly by credible witnesses for decades. The question of what that something is has not been answered, and the frustrating, interesting, genuinely honest thing about the Yakima case is that the answer might be findable, might be sitting in the rock beneath the ridge, or in the electromagnetic properties of the fault systems, or in some combination of natural and human activity that no one has yet had the resources or the commitment to fully investigate. The ridge will continue to be there. The lights, by all available evidence, will continue to appear, and the file that Bill Vogel started keeping in the early 1970s, careful, methodical, specific, will continue to accumulate entries, waiting for someone to bring the kind of sustained scientific attention that the record has always suggested it deserves. Which brings us naturally to the individual cases themselves, the specific documented events that form the core of that record, and that remain, even after careful scrutiny, genuinely difficult to explain away. So let's look at some of those cases more closely, not as proof of anything, but as the actual substance of the record, the specific events that give the Yakima file its weight. The first one worth sitting with is from August 1972. David Akers was on Toppenish Ridge as part of his initial fieldwork for the Center for UFO Studies Investigation. The conditions that night were clear, with good visibility across the ridge and down into the valley below. Akers had positioned himself at one of the fire lookout observation points, equipped with binoculars and a camera, and was conducting a systematic watch. The kind of methodical, timed observation that distinguishes serious fieldwork from casual skywatching. At some point during the watch, he observed a light source that he could not immediately account for. It appeared at low altitude above the ridge, moving slowly and without any sound that he could detect. The colour was amber to orange, and the apparent size at distance he estimated as roughly comparable to a bright star, but lower, closer, and moving in a way that stars do not move. He tracked it through binoculars. It moved laterally along the ridge for a period, then stopped. Then it began to dim slowly, as if whatever was producing the light was reducing output rather than moving away. Then it brightened again. Then it moved in a different direction, not continuing along the original line of travel but shifting, as if it had changed its mind about where it was going. Akers logged the duration, the direction of initial appearance, the apparent altitude, the colour, the behavioural sequence, and the absence of sound. He attempted photographs, though the low light level and the lack of a fixed reference point made those difficult to evaluate afterward. What he wrote in his field notes was careful and specific. He described what he saw without claiming to know what it was. He noted that the object's behaviour, the hovering, the dimming and brightening, the directional change, was inconsistent with conventional aircraft, with known atmospheric phenomena, and with anything he could attribute to a known source in the area. He also noted that he could not rule out explanations he was not aware of. That kind of careful epistemic humility is part of what makes Akers' records valuable. He was not trying to prove anything. He was trying to document accurately. What makes this particular observation significant in the broader Yakima record is not that it was dramatic. It was not by the standards of UFO reports, but that it was made by a trained observer using instruments, under good conditions, with contemporaneous written documentation. It is the kind of case that holds up when you apply normal evidentiary standards. It does not prove that something extraordinary was present, but it establishes solidly that something was present that the observer could not explain, and that the observer was the kind of person whose inability to explain it carries some weight. The second case is from 1975, and it involves a group of tribal fire lookout observers on Toppenish Ridge. This was during the period of intensified activity, when sightings were more frequent, and more of the reservation's own personnel were among the witnesses. The specific event involved multiple observers who were on duty at the Ridge Lookout Station, and who reported watching an object hover over a section of the ridge for an extended period. Accounts vary slightly, but the duration was described as somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. The object they described was larger than what Akers had documented in 1972, estimated at roughly the apparent size of a full moon when viewed at arm's length, which is a significant angular size for something that is not the moon. It was glowing amber orange, similar in colour to the lights documented in other Yakima cases. It was stationary for much of the observation period, which ruled out most conventional aircraft. It did not produce any audible sound. At some point during the observation, one of the witnesses directed a flashlight toward the object. This was a practice that had been described in earlier accounts, and apparently some of the lookout staff had heard about or tried it before. According to the witnesses, the object responded. It moved in the direction of the light, closing some of the distance between itself and the observers, then stopped again. Now, the flashlight response is one of the more unusual recurring elements in the Yakima record, and it is worth being careful about how you interpret it. It appears in multiple independent accounts across different years and different observers. It was noted by Akers, mentioned in Vogel's logs, and described by tribal witnesses. The consistency of this specific detail across unconnected reports is one of the things that makes it harder to dismiss as pure confabulation. At the same time, it is exactly the kind of detail that is difficult to verify and easy to misremember or misinterpret. A moving object that you are watching while also shining a flashlight at it creates conditions where it is genuinely hard to know whether the object moved toward you or whether your perception of its position shifted. Human visual tracking under low-light conditions is not reliable. These are legitimate cautions. But the witnesses in the 1975 event were not casual observers. They were on duty at a fire lookout station, trained to observe and report accurately, and they were watching the sky as part of their professional responsibilities. Their accounts were consistent with each other and with the broader pattern of Yakima reports. The flashlight response they described, the object moving closer and then stopping, was not something they had reason to fabricate, and the detail itself, strange as it sounds, matches what other independent witnesses had reported in different years. The third case is less about a dramatic event and more about a specific type of observation that appeared several times in the mid-1970s. Apparent emergence of light from ground level or near ground level on the hillside itself. Several witnesses across this period described seeing a light that appeared not to descend from above but to originate from the hillside, emerging from the terrain rather than approaching from the sky. One account from around 1974 or 1975, documented in the Yakima files, described a witness watching a section of hillside on the ridge when a glowing form appeared to rise out of the ground, hover briefly at low altitude, move laterally for a short distance, and then descend back into the terrain. This type of report is interesting for several reasons. It does not fit the conventional UFO narrative of craft arriving from the sky. It fits more naturally with the Earthlights hypothesis, the idea that geological stress can produce luminous plasma phenomena that emerge from the ground itself, particularly along fault lines. The Toppenish Ridge fault system runs beneath exactly the terrain where these emergence reports were concentrated. If you were designing a test for the tectonic Earthlights hypothesis, ground emergence observations near a known fault would be precisely the kind of data point you would look for. That does not confirm the hypothesis, but it is a specific correlation that deserves more attention than it has received. The fourth case is from 1976, and it is different in character from the others. This one involves a vehicle encounter on a reservation road. A person driving on a road near the southern edge of the Yakima reservation in the evening reported that an object, described as a glowing sphere, amber-coloured, roughly the size of a large truck at perceived distance, began following the vehicle. The witness described it as pacing the car, maintaining a consistent distance and altitude as the vehicle moved along the road. When the driver slowed, the object slowed. When the driver accelerated, it appeared to accelerate. This continued for several miles before the object veered away from the road and disappeared behind a ridge. Vehicle pacing reports are a recurring type in UFO literature, and they are also one of the types most susceptible to misidentification, particularly of celestial objects like the moon or bright planets, which can appear to follow a moving vehicle because of the geometry of observation. This is a well-documented perceptual illusion, and it is a reasonable first explanation to apply. The problem with applying it in this case is that the witness was on the Yakima reservation, in terrain where the horizon is defined by ridgelines rather than open sky, and the object was described as being at a low altitude relative to the surrounding terrain, not high in the sky where a planet or the moon would be. The object was also described as disappearing behind a physical ridge, which is inconsistent with a celestial object, which would simply continue its apparent position regardless of terrain. These details do not prove the account, but they do make the simple celestial misidentification explanation harder to apply cleanly. What the 1976 vehicle case adds to the Yakima record is not dramatic evidence of anything extraordinary. It adds another data point in a specific behavioural category, apparent responsiveness to human presence and movement, that appears across multiple cases in different forms. The flashlight response in the 1975 event, the approach toward observers in earlier accounts, the pacing behaviour in the 1976 road case. These are 3 different types of apparent interaction, documented in different years by different witnesses, all suggesting that whatever was producing these lights was in some way responsive to human activity, rather than simply moving through the landscape indifferently. That pattern, if it is a genuine pattern and not a collection of coincidences and misperceptions, is one of the most difficult aspects of the Yakima record to account for within any of the standard explanatory frameworks. Natural plasma phenomena, if that is what the Earthlights hypothesis describes, do not respond to flashlights or pace vehicles. Conventional aircraft do not hover for 45 minutes and then move toward a lookout observer. The behavioural dimension of the Yakima reports is what makes the geological explanation feel incomplete even when the geology is clearly relevant. And it is what makes the military testing explanation feel incomplete too, because sustained, interactive testing operations of that kind, over that duration, in that location, would be extraordinarily difficult to conceal from the level of observation that was actually taking place on the ridge. Taken individually, as I said at the start, each of these cases has possible explanations. The 1972 acres observation could be an unusual atmospheric phenomenon. The 1975 multi-witness event could involve a misperception of the flashlight response. The ground emergence reports could be a perceptual effect combined with unusual natural lighting. The vehicle pacing case could be a celestial misidentification that the details do not quite fit. Each one, individually, can be pushed into an explanatory box if you are willing to accept some strain in the fit. But the Yakima record is not 4 cases. It is 50 years of cases, concentrated in a specific geographic area, documented by multiple independent observers with different backgrounds and different motivations, showing consistent behavioural characteristics across decades: the amber colour, the silence, the low altitude over the ridge, the apparent responsiveness, the ground emergence. These elements appear again and again in accounts that were not made by people who had read each other's reports or coordinated their descriptions. Bill Vogel's logs from the early 1970s describe characteristics that match what tribal observers reported in 1975 and what a driver on a reservation road reported in 1976. The consistency is not perfect. These are human accounts, and human accounts are never perfectly consistent, but it is substantial enough to be striking. What the individual cases give you, when you look at them carefully, is a sense of texture. Not a single dramatic event that demands explanation, but a long quiet accumulation of specific observations that collectively resist easy dismissal. The Yakima record is not built on one compelling incident. It is built on the kind of repetition and consistency that, in any other domain of inquiry, would be taken seriously as evidence that something real and persistent is occurring in a specific location. The question of what that something is remains open, and the modern era of documentation, with its cameras, its databases, and its renewed government interest in aerial phenomena, has added a new layer to that record without so far providing the answer that 50 years of careful observation has been quietly waiting for. So where does that leave us when we move forward in time, past the 1970s and 1980s, into the decades that followed? The Yakima Valley did not stop producing reports. The ridge did not go quiet. What changed, gradually, was the infrastructure around the reports, how they were collected, where they went, and what tools people had when they saw something they could not explain. Through the 1990s, sightings continued to come in from the Yakima area, though without the concentrated scientific fieldwork that had characterized the earlier period. The observation posts on Toppenish Ridge were no longer staffed by researchers with light measuring equipment. The systematic logging that had made Vogel's records so valuable was no longer being maintained in the same way. But the reports kept arriving, through local newspapers, through UFO organisations, and increasingly through the internet, which was beginning to give people a place to put experiences they had previously kept to themselves or shared only with close acquaintances. One of the most important developments for Yakima's modern documentation record was the National UFO Reporting Center, known as NUFORC, which is based in Washington state. NUFORC was established in 1974, but its reach expanded dramatically with the internet. Peter Davenport, who took over the organization in 1994, built it into one of the most comprehensive civilian UFO report databases in the world. Yakima County appears in that database with notable frequency, not in a dramatic headline-grabbing way, but in the steady, persistent way that characterizes places where something has been happening for a long time. If you search the NUFORC database for Yakima County reports, you find accounts spanning from the 1990s through the present decade, describing lights over the valley, objects near Toppenish Ridge, and phenomena consistent with what was documented in the 1970s. The language changes across the decades. People in the 1990s describe things differently than people in the 1970s did, partly because the cultural vocabulary around these phenomena has shifted, but the core descriptions remain recognizable. Amber or orange glowing objects, low altitude, silence, behavior that does not match conventional aircraft. One thing worth noting about NUFORC reports is that they are self-submitted accounts, which means they carry the limitations of any self-reported data. There is no systematic verification, no follow-up fieldwork in most cases, and no way to filter out misidentifications, hoaxes, or honest mistakes. Davenport and his colleagues have always been clear about this. The database is a record of what people reported, not a certified record of what actually happened. But the volume and geographic concentration of Yakima County reports is still meaningful as a signal, even if individual entries require skepticism. When a location consistently produces reports across 5 decades from people who are not connected to each other, and who are not in most cases part of any UFO subculture, that consistency is worth noting, even if you cannot take every account at face value. The 2000s brought new tools, smartphone cameras became ubiquitous by the early 2010s, and dash cams became common in American vehicles not long after. For the first time in the history of the Yakima phenomenon, ordinary people driving on reservation roads or standing in their orchards had a recording device in their pocket. This changed the evidence landscape in ways that are genuinely complicated. On one hand, more footage exists of unusual aerial phenomena from the Yakima area than ever before. On the other hand, the footage is highly variable in quality, context, and interpretability. A glowing light filmed on a smartphone at night, without reference points, without metadata, and without corroborating witnesses, is almost impossible to analyze meaningfully. The camera captures something, but it does not capture enough of the surrounding context to tell you what that something is. A few modern Yakima cases have produced footage that researchers found worth examining. In the mid-2000s, at least 2 separate video clips emerged from the Toppenish Ridge area showing moving lights at night that did not immediately match the flight paths of known aircraft in the region. Neither clip was definitive, both were short, both lacked sufficient resolution to determine size or altitude, and neither had independent corroboration from radar or other sensors at the time of filming. But both were consistent with the historical description of the Yakima lights, in terms of colour and apparent movement. They were added to the regional record without resolving anything. What the smartphone era has also done is change the social dimension of reporting. When a person in the Yakima Valley sees something unusual in the sky today, they can film it, post it, and have thousands of people offering opinions within hours. This is both useful and problematic. It is useful because it creates an immediate record that did not exist before. It is problematic because the speed of social media response often means that a video is interpreted, shared, and culturally processed before anyone with relevant expertise has had a chance to look at it carefully. The context collapses quickly. A video that might have been worth careful analysis becomes, within a day or two, just another piece of content in a very large stream. The careful, methodical approach that made Vogel's logs and Acres fieldwork so valuable is harder to sustain in an environment where everything moves this fast. Then came 2017, and things shifted at a national level in a way that nobody in the UFO research community had quite anticipated. In December of that year, the New York Times published a report revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, known as AATIP, a Pentagon program that had been studying unidentified aerial phenomena from 2007 to 2012, funded at approximately $22 million per year. The article also published declassified footage from US Navy pilots, showing encounters with objects that behaved in ways the pilots could not explain. Rapid acceleration, no visible propulsion, movement against the wind. The footage had names: the Tic Tac video, the Gimbal video, the Go Fast video. They became widely known almost immediately. This was a meaningful moment, not because it proved anything about what the objects were, but because it established that the US government had been taking the subject seriously enough to fund a formal program, and that credentialed military pilots were having encounters they could not account for. The stigma that had long discouraged serious people from engaging publicly with this topic began to shift, at least slightly. Congress held hearings. The Pentagon established a successor office, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, and later the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, known as AARO, which began in 2022. NASA commissioned its own independent study panel, which released a report in 2023 acknowledging that some UAP reports could not be explained with available data and recommending improved data collection. All of this renewed national attention raised an obvious question for anyone familiar with the Yakima record. Would any of this official interest eventually focus on historical hotspots? Would a location with 50 years of documented, carefully logged sightings, investigated by credentialed researchers, receive any specific attention from the new generation of government UAP inquiry? As of the early 2020s, the answer appears to be no, at least not publicly. The new government programs are focused primarily on military sensor data, pilot reports, and cases where radar, infrared, or electro-optical systems captured something anomalous. Historical civilian cases, even well-documented ones like Yakima, do not fit neatly into the data-driven framework that AARO and similar bodies have adopted. This is understandable from a methodological standpoint. Government investigators working in 2023 cannot go back and re-examine what was seen over Toppenish Ridge in 1975 with any new instrumentation. The moment is gone. What remains is the documentary record, Vogel's logs, Acres' published report, Hynek's assessment, and the accumulated decades of consistent accounts. That record is real, and it is detailed, but it is not the kind of sensor data that modern UAP investigation frameworks are built around. There is something a little frustrating about this gap if you have spent any time with the Yakima material. The valley has one of the longest and most carefully documented civilian UFO records in the United States. It was investigated by a scientist who had served as the US Air Force's own consultant on aerial phenomena. The reports show consistent behavioural characteristics across 5 decades, and yet it sits largely outside the frame of the current official inquiry, which is oriented toward recent military encounters rather than long-duration civilian hotspots. Whether that gap will eventually close, whether a future investigation will look at geographic concentration data and find Yakima appearing in a way that demands attention, is genuinely unknown. What the modern era has given the Yakima record is volume without resolution. There are more reports than ever. There is more footage than ever. The national conversation about UAP has made it slightly more socially acceptable to report unusual aerial sightings without fear of being dismissed entirely. And yet the core questions that Vogel was quietly writing down in his log in 1972 — what are these lights? Where do they come from? Why this ridge? Why this valley? — remain exactly as open as they were then. The technology has changed. The cultural context has changed. The institutional framework around the topic has changed, at least somewhat, but the amber lights over Toppenish Ridge, whatever they are, appear to have continued regardless. One small detail that feels worth mentioning is that the Yakima Training Center, the large army installation that sits adjacent to the reservation, has continued to operate through all of this. Military training exercises, drone testing, and various other activities have taken place there across the same decades that produced the civilian sighting record. The proximity is always worth keeping in mind. Some fraction of what has been reported over the Yakima Valley across the modern era is almost certainly connected to military activity at that installation. The challenge is that military observers themselves have, at various points, reported things they could not account for, and the training centre's presence does not explain the pre-1972 tribal accounts or the specific behavioural patterns that characterise the most carefully documented cases. It remains a relevant variable without being a complete answer. There is also the question of what the NUFORC database, for all its limitations, actually shows when you look at it geographically. Yakima County is not the only location in Washington state that produces consistent reports. The Cascades generally, and the region around Mount Rainier in particular, have long histories of unusual aerial phenomena going back to Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting. But within that broader regional pattern, Yakima County, and specifically the area around Toppenish Ridge, appears with a frequency and consistency that stands out even against the elevated regional baseline. This is not a scientific finding. The database has too many methodological limitations for that. But it is a pattern that is visible to anyone who spends time looking at the geographic distribution of reports, and it is consistent with what the 1970s fieldwork suggested, that something about this specific location produces these specific reports in a way that is not simply a function of population density or reporting culture. The modern documentation era, then, has added layers to the Yakima record without fundamentally changing its character. The lights that Vogel first began logging over 50 years ago are still being reported. The ridge is still the focal point. The descriptions are still consistent in their core elements. And the question of what is actually happening in that landscape, on those basalt ridges, above those hop fields, over that particular fold in the earth, remains as genuinely open as it has ever been. The tools we now have are better. The willingness of institutions to take the subject seriously, while still limited, is greater than it was in 1972. And the Yakima record, with its careful logs and its decades of consistent observation, is waiting for the kind of rigorous, sustained attention that would actually give it a chance of being understood. Which brings us naturally to the question of what that understanding might even look like. Because before you can explain what is happening in Yakima Valley, you have to work through what the competing explanations actually are, what evidence each of them can account for, and where each of them runs into the specific details of this specific record in ways that are difficult to ignore. So let us actually work through those explanations one by one as honestly as we can. The most straightforward explanation, the one that skeptics often reach for first, and reasonably so, is misidentification. The idea that what people have been seeing over Toppenish Ridge for 50 years is in most cases conventional aircraft, military hardware, or other identifiable aerial objects that were simply misread in the dark, at distance, under conditions that make accurate observation difficult. This is not a dismissive argument, it is a serious one. The Yakima Training Center is a large active military installation covering roughly 330,000 acres just north and east of the reservation. It has been used for artillery training, helicopter operations, drone testing, and various other exercises across the entire period that produced the Yakima sighting record. Military aircraft operating without lights, or with unusual light configurations for night exercises, could plausibly explain a portion of what has been reported. Flares, illumination rounds, and other training pyrotechnics could account for some of the amber and orange glowing objects that witnesses described. This is a real variable, and it would be intellectually dishonest to minimize it. But the misidentification argument runs into some specific difficulties when you press it against the actual documented cases. Vogel was not a naive observer. He was a trained fire control officer whose job involved watching terrain and sky carefully, logging what he saw with precision, and distinguishing between normal and abnormal. He knew what military aircraft looked like. He knew what flares looked like. He had been watching that ridge for years before he started logging the unusual lights, and the fact that he found them unusual enough to log separately is itself meaningful. Akers, similarly, was not a casual observer. He set up proper observation posts, used calibrated equipment, and documented what he saw in a published report. When he described an orange sphere moving silently against the wind, he was not describing something he could not distinguish from a helicopter, and the flashlight response behaviour, that specific repeated detail where shining a light toward the object appeared to produce a reaction from it, does not fit any conventional aircraft or military training scenario in any obvious way. Flares do not respond to flashlights. Helicopters do not change course because someone pointed a light at them from a ridge. This detail, more than almost any other in the Yakima record, resists the misidentification framework. The second broad category is atmospheric and meteorological phenomena. Ball lightning is occasionally invoked to explain glowing, moving light forms, and it is a real phenomenon. Electrical plasma structures that can persist for several seconds to a few minutes, move in unexpected ways, and produce light in the orange to amber range. Temperature inversions can cause unusual optical effects, bending light from distant sources in ways that make stationary objects appear to move, or create apparent glowing shapes from reflected ground light. Bioluminescence is sometimes mentioned in connection with certain insects or atmospheric particles, though this is less relevant to the Yakima terrain. These are legitimate atmospheric effects, and some fraction of any long-duration sighting record from any location is probably attributable to them. The problem is duration and behaviour. Ball lightning is typically observed for seconds, occasionally up to a minute or two. The Yakima sightings frequently involved objects observed for 10, 20, 40 minutes at a time, making directional changes, hovering, splitting, and merging. The 1975 Toppenish Ridge event, where a glowing object was watched for over 40 minutes by multiple observers, is not compatible with ball lightning in any straightforward way. Temperature inversions can produce strange visual effects, but they do not explain objects that appear to respond to stimuli or that multiple observers track making deliberate-looking course corrections. Atmospheric explanations may account for some of the shorter, simpler sightings in the record. They do not come close to accounting for the most carefully documented cases. The third framework is the Earthlights hypothesis, and this one deserves more careful attention than it usually gets in popular discussions. The Yakima Fold Belt is a real geological structure. The Columbia River basalt that underlies the region is one of the largest flood basalt formations on the continent, and the anticlinal ridges of the Fold Belt, including Toppenish Ridge specifically, are the result of ongoing tectonic compression. The region is seismically active. There are documented fault systems running beneath and adjacent to the ridge. The hypothesis associated with researchers like Paul Devereaux and, in a different form, Michael Persinger, proposes that piezoelectric effects in stressed crystalline rock can generate electrical charge, which under the right conditions can ionize the surrounding air and produce luminous plasma phenomena, glowing, moving, sometimes apparently intelligent-looking light forms that are entirely natural in origin, but produced by geological processes rather than atmospheric ones. This is not a fringe idea invented to explain UFOs. The piezoelectric effect is real and well documented in laboratory settings. The question is whether it operates at sufficient scale in natural geological formations to produce the kinds of phenomena described at Yakima. Some researchers argue that it does, and that the geographic clustering of UFO sightings around fault systems and seismically active areas worldwide supports this. The Yakima correlation is actually one of the better examples of this geographic overlap. The ridge is both the geological boundary and the focal point of the sighting record, and that is at minimum an interesting coincidence. The Earthlights model also has the advantage of explaining the long historical record, including pre-modern tribal accounts, without requiring any technological or extraterrestrial agency. Where it struggles is, again, with the behavioural details. Piezoelectric plasma phenomena, if they exist at the scale required, would be expected to behave according to physical principles, drifting with air currents, dissipating in predictable ways, not responding to human stimuli. The flashlight response observations are a genuine problem for this model. A plasma structure generated by rock stress does not have sensors. It cannot detect a flashlight beam and react to it. Either those observations are mistaken, which is possible since human perception under unusual conditions is unreliable, or there is something about the phenomenon that the Earthlights model does not capture. It is also worth noting that Persinger's broader neurological claims about electromagnetic fields affecting human perception and producing apparent anomalous experiences have not replicated well under controlled conditions. The geological component of the Earthlights hypothesis is more credible than some of its extensions, but even the core geological claim remains unproven at the field scale required to explain Yakima. The fourth explanation is psychological and social. The idea that communities primed to look for unusual lights will find them, that expectation shapes perception, and that once a location develops a reputation for sightings, it tends to produce more sightings partly because more people are looking, and partly because ambiguous stimuli get interpreted through the available cultural frame. This is a real effect. It is documented in the psychology of perception and in the sociology of how anomalous claims spread through communities. The fact that Yakima had a known reputation as a UFO hotspot by the mid-1970s almost certainly influenced how subsequent observers interpreted what they saw. Some fraction of the later sighting record is probably shaped by this dynamic. But social contagion does not explain the 1972 observations that preceded the reputation. Vogel was not logging lights because he had heard stories about lights over the ridge. He was logging them because he was seeing them before the location had any public profile as a UFO site. Akers arrived as an outside investigator with a scientific skeptical framework and documented things that he found genuinely difficult to explain. Hynek, who had spent years debunking UFO reports for the Air Force, assessed the Yakima material as among the most credible he had encountered. These are not people who are primed to see UFOs and found what they were looking for. The social contagion model may explain some of the volume of later reports, but it cannot account for the foundational observations that established the record in the first place. The fifth possibility is classified military or government programs. This is the explanation that is hardest to evaluate because, by definition, if a program is classified, its existence cannot be confirmed from public sources. The general argument is that the United States government, across the Cold War and post-Cold War periods, has tested various experimental aircraft, surveillance platforms, and other technologies in areas that are remote but accessible, and that some fraction of UFO sightings in any given region may be encounters with classified hardware that observers simply cannot identify because they have no reference frame for it. This is not implausible in general terms. The history of black programs, the U-2, the SR-71, the B-2, various drone programs, shows that the government has routinely operated platforms that produced UFO reports until they were eventually declassified. The Yakima Training Center's presence makes this explanation locally relevant. It's entirely possible that some of what was seen over the valley across the decades was connected to classified testing or surveillance operations that used the training center's airspace or the reservation's relative isolation. The difficulty is that this explanation, like the others, does not cover the full record. Classified aircraft do not respond to flashlights, they do not emerge from hillsides or appear to descend into the ground. They do not produce consistent reports of the same basic form. Amber spheres, silent, low-altitude, hovering, across 50 years, because classified programs change and evolve. The F-117 stealth fighter, which was tested secretly in the Nevada desert through the late 1970s and 1980s, produced UFO reports, but those reports described something angular and strange-looking, consistent with what observers were actually seeing. The Yakima descriptions are remarkably consistent in their core form across decades, which is harder to square with an evolving military technology program. There is also the matter of the pre-1972 tribal accounts. If the lights over Toppenish Ridge have been part of the landscape's character for generations, then a classified military program of any recent vintage cannot be their origin. Either the tribal accounts describe something different from what was observed in the 1970s, which is possible, or they describe the same basic phenomenon, in which case its history predates any plausible government program. That leaves the sixth category, which is simply genuinely anomalous phenomena of unknown origin. This is not the same as saying extraterrestrial spacecraft, though that is one possibility within the category. It means acknowledging that the documented record contains observations that do not fit cleanly into any of the preceding frameworks, and that the honest scientific response to that situation is to say so, rather than to force the data into an inadequate explanation. Hynek himself used the phrase residual unknowns to describe cases that remained unexplained after thorough analysis. Not because he was claiming they were alien craft, but because he was a scientist who understood that "I don't know" is sometimes the most accurate answer available. The Yakima record, taken as a whole, appears to contain a meaningful residual unknown component. The most carefully documented cases, the ones with trained observers, systematic logging, calibrated equipment, and multiple independent witnesses, include observations that are not satisfactorily explained by misidentification, atmospheric effects, geology, social psychology, or classified hardware. The flashlight response behavior in particular is something that none of the naturalistic explanations handles well. The radar returns from the mid-1970s add a layer of physical evidence that goes beyond eyewitness testimony. The geographic concentration on Toppenish Ridge, consistent across 5 decades, suggests something location-specific rather than something random. What is genuinely interesting about sitting with all 6 of these frameworks together is that they are not mutually exclusive. It is entirely possible, in fact it seems likely, that the Yakima sighting record contains examples of several different phenomena, some of which have conventional explanations and some of which do not. Vogel's 50-year log almost certainly includes military aircraft, atmospheric oddities, misidentified planets and satellites, and other mundane things alongside whatever was producing the more anomalous observations. The challenge is separating them, and that separation requires exactly the kind of systematic, instrumented, long-duration fieldwork that was briefly attempted in the 1970s and then largely abandoned. The honest summary is this: no single explanation covers the documented Yakima record. Each framework accounts for something and fails to account for something else. The misidentification argument handles some cases and fails on the behavioural details. The atmospheric models handle some cases and fail on duration and apparent responsiveness. The geological model is scientifically interesting and geographically compelling, but remains unproven and behaviourally incomplete. The social model explains some of the volume, but not the foundational cases. The classified program model is plausible in part, but not across the full historical record. And the genuinely anomalous category, while intellectually uncomfortable, is the only one that does not require dismissing specific documented observations to maintain its coherence. This is not a satisfying place to land if you came looking for a clean answer, but it is an accurate one. The Yakima Valley has been producing these reports for over 50 years, and the people who have looked most carefully at the record, not the enthusiasts who wanted to believe, but the careful investigators who wanted to understand, have consistently found that the phenomenon resists simple resolution. Hynek said as much. Arca's published report said as much. The pattern in the data says as much. There is something worth sitting with in that uncertainty, not as a frustration, but as a genuine feature of the situation. The world contains things that are not yet understood. That has always been true, and it will remain true regardless of how sophisticated our instruments become. The Yakima Valley is one of the places where that fact is particularly visible, where the documentation is careful enough and the history long enough that the gap between what has been observed and what has been explained is hard to paper over. It is a gap that deserves better attention than it has received. And that really is what brings everything back to the valley itself, the orchards and the ridge and the wide open sky above the basalt, and to what it means that this particular landscape has held this particular question for so long. So let us go back to the valley one more time. Picture it in late summer, when the light in central Washington has that particular quality, golden and slightly hazy, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look a little more permanent than it actually is. The hop yards are full, the apple orchards are heavy with fruit, the Yakima River is low and clear and cold, running through a landscape that smells of irrigation water and dry sage and warm basalt. The city of Yakima sits in its bowl of hills, going about its business the way it always has. Trucks moving through the agricultural co-ops, the fruit stands open along the highway, the mountain sitting blue and enormous to the west. It is a working place, a practical place. Not the kind of landscape you would immediately associate with one of the longest and most carefully documented UFO cases in American history. And yet, somewhere to the south, Toppenish Ridge rises to roughly 3,000 feet and runs east to west for about 20 miles, separating the valley floor from the higher plateau beyond. From a distance, it is not dramatic. It is just a ridge. The way this part of Washington is full of ridges, folded and compressed by millions of years of tectonic pressure, underlain by basalt that goes down thousands of feet, crossed by fault lines that occasionally remind the region they are still active. In the long summer evenings, when the sky above the valley goes from blue to amber to deep violet, the ridge sits dark against the fading light. And if you are patient and you are watching and the conditions are right, well, that is where the story has always lived. Bill Vogel started keeping his logs around 1972. He was a Bureau of Indian Affairs fire control officer working out of the Yakima Reservation, and he was not a person given to exaggeration. He was the kind of man who noted the time, the duration, the direction, the behaviour and the weather conditions, and then he wrote it down. Night after night, year after year, he and the other fire lookout observers on Toppenish Ridge documented what they were seeing. Amber and orange spheres moving low over the ridgeline, lights that split and merged, objects that appeared to respond when a flashlight was aimed at them. He was not trying to prove anything. He was trying to record what was there. That careful, unglamorous, patient work is what eventually brought David Akers out from the Center for UFO Studies, and what eventually brought Hynek himself to the valley, and what put Yakima on the map of serious UFO research in a way that very few locations have ever managed to achieve. What Hynek found when he looked at the Yakima record was something he described as among the most credible and consistent body of sightings he had encountered in his long career, and his career had included years as the Air Force's own scientific consultant, years of reviewing thousands of reports from across the country, years of careful skepticism about a subject that invited credulity. He was not an easy man to impress. He had spent the better part of 2 decades explaining away sightings as misidentified aircraft, weather balloons, astronomical objects, and human error. By the time he encountered Yakima, he had moved past that reflex. He understood that the honest scientific position was to follow the data rather than the preferred conclusion, and the data from Yakima was not going away. Akers' fieldwork on Toppenish Ridge produced a formal published report. That is worth pausing on. Not a website post, not a forum thread, not an enthusiast account. A formal report, based on instrumented observation, from a trained investigator who set up on the ridge with calibrated equipment and watched. What he documented included orange glowing spheres moving against the wind, objects that dimmed and brightened in apparent patterns, and the flashlight response behaviour that multiple independent observers had already reported. He did not claim to know what these things were. He documented what they did. That distinction matters enormously in a field where the temptation to overclaim is constant. The Yakima Nation's relationship with this landscape adds a dimension to the story that is easy to underweight if you are approaching it purely from the outside. The reservation land that encompasses Toppenish Ridge is not simply a geographic boundary. It is a place with a deep and continuous human history, a place where generations of tribal members have watched the same ridges in the same sky, and where accounts of unusual lights over those ridges predate the modern UFO era by a very long time. This does not prove anything in the scientific sense, but it does mean that whatever is happening over Toppenish Ridge is not a product of 1970s popular culture or post-Kenneth Arnold mass suggestion. It has been part of the landscape's character for longer than any of the investigators who came to study it have been alive. That is a significant thing to sit with. The geological character of the region offers one of the more scientifically grounded possible frameworks. The Yakima Fold Belt is a real structure, and the Columbia River basalt group beneath it is one of the largest flood basalt formations on the continent. The hypothesis that tectonic stress in quartz-bearing rock can produce piezoelectric effects that ionize air and generate luminous plasma, earthlights, in the terminology of researchers like Paul Devereux, is not fringe speculation. It is a testable physical mechanism. The fault lines near Toppenish Ridge are real. The seismic activity in the region is documented. If tectonic strain lights are a real phenomenon, and there is evidence from other locations that something like this occurs, then the Yakima Fold Belt is exactly the kind of geological environment where you would expect to find them. The problem, as always, is that the geological model handles the basic presence of glowing lights and does not handle the apparent behavioural complexity. Rocks under stress do not respond to flashlights. They do not produce objects that follow vehicles down reservation roads, or that hover for 40 minutes and then make direction changes inconsistent with the wind. The geology is probably part of the story. It is probably not the whole story. The military dimension is real too. The Yakima Training Center is a large installation, and its airspace has been used for training exercises for decades. Classified programs have used the broader Pacific Northwest as a testing environment. Radar returns from the mid-1970s are harder to explain away than eyewitness testimony alone. But the core descriptions from Yakima, amber spheres, silent, low altitude, consistent in form across 50 years, do not fit the profile of an evolving classified technology program, because classified programs change. The F-117 produced UFO reports, but those reports described something angular and strange, because that is what observers were actually seeing. The Yakima descriptions are remarkably stable across decades. That stability is one of the genuinely puzzling features of the record. What you're left with, when you've gone through all the frameworks honestly, is a documented record that is larger and more consistent than any single explanation can cover. And that is not a comfortable place to end up if you wanted a clean answer. But it is an accurate one. The people who have looked most carefully at Yakima, not the enthusiasts, but the careful investigators, have consistently found that the phenomenon resists resolution. Hynek said so. Akers' report said so. The data, taken across 5 decades, says so. There is something worth sitting with in that. Not as a frustration, and not as a mystery in the dramatic thriller novel sense, but as a genuine feature of the situation. The world contains things that are not yet understood. That has always been true. It will remain true regardless of how many satellites we put in orbit or how many sensors we point at the sky. The Yakima Valley is one of the places where that fact is unusually visible, where the documentation is careful enough and the history long enough that the gap between what has been observed and what has been explained is genuinely difficult to close. And the valley keeps going. The reports have not stopped. The National UFO Reporting Center, based right here in Washington state, continues to receive accounts from Yakima County. Some of them almost certainly mundane, some of them harder to categorize. The people who live there, the farmers and the tribal members and the workers who spend time outdoors in the long summer nights, are still occasionally seeing things over the ridge that they cannot account for. Most of them do not file reports. Most of them mention it to a neighbour or remember it quietly and go on with their lives. That is probably how it has always worked. Vogel's logs represent the exceptional case, the person who decided to write it down systematically night after night because he thought the record mattered. He was right. The record does matter. It is one of the reasons Yakima is still a subject worth discussing 50 years later. What strikes you, when you have spent time with this story, is how ordinary the setting is. This is not a remote wilderness. It is not a place at the edge of the world. It is a working agricultural valley in central Washington, full of people who grow apples and hops and raise families and watch the mariners and drive pickup trucks down county roads. The ridge is visible from town on a clear day. The sky above the valley is wide and open and full of stars on summer nights. And somewhere in that ordinary landscape, something has been happening for a very long time that the best available explanations have not fully accounted for. That is, in its quiet way, a remarkable thing. Not because it proves any particular theory, not because it confirms the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or the geological hypothesis, or any other framework, but because it demonstrates that careful, patient, methodical observation of a specific place over a long period of time can reveal patterns that casual attention misses entirely. Vogel's 50 years of logs, Acres instrumented fieldwork, Hynek's assessment. These are not the products of credulity or wishful thinking. They are the products of people who took the question seriously enough to actually look, for long enough to see what was there. If you live in the Yakima Valley, or if you've driven through it on a summer evening with the windows down and the sage coming through the air, you might understand something intuitively about what it means to watch that ridge in the dark. There is a quality to the landscape at night, the way the basalt holds the heat of the day, the way the sky seems larger than it does in most places, the way the silence is not quite silent but full of small sounds that you cannot always identify. It is the kind of place where paying attention feels natural, where the sky invites watching, and where, apparently, watching has sometimes been rewarded with something that the watchers could not explain. The lights over Toppenish Ridge are still there by most accounts, moving quietly at low altitude over the basalt, amber and orange, appearing and disappearing, occasionally responding to something below them in ways that do not fit the behaviour of anything we have a good name for. They have been there, in one form or another, for longer than the modern UFO era, longer than the reservation boundaries, longer than the hop fields and the orchards and the irrigation canals that make the valley what it is today, whatever they are. If you have your own experience with this place, if you have seen something over the valley or the ridge, or if you have a thought about what any of this might mean, the comments are open, and genuinely, those kinds of accounts are worth sharing. Not because they will solve the mystery, but because the record is only as good as the people who contribute to it. Vogel understood that. Acres understood it. The record they built together is the reason we're still talking about this valley tonight. If this kind of quiet, careful storytelling is something you find yourself coming back to, a like and a subscription genuinely help this channel keep going, and they are always appreciated more than you might think. For now, though, go back to the image of the ridge in the dark, the valley floor below it, the irrigation channels catching the last of the starlight, the orchard still and heavy with late summer fruit, and up on the ridge, if the conditions are right, and you are patient enough to wait, something moving through the dark above the basalt. Unhurried, silent, following whatever pattern it follows, as it apparently has been doing, quietly and without explanation, for a very long time.